Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The dispatch call came through at 11:47 p.m., which meant Asher Lockwood had exactly 13 minutes to get his rig from the truck stop on exit 286 to the distribution center on the east side of Oklahoma City. He had been sitting in the driver's lounge nursing a cup of burnt coffee and watching a muted basketball game on the television above the vending machines when his phone buzzed with the automated text from Delphine Mercer, the night dispatcher he had worked with for the past 2 years. The message was short and direct, the way she always kept things after midnight. Sealed load waiting, I-40 eastbound, no stops, confirm pickup by 0:15. Asher rubbed his eyes and stood up, stretching his back until it cracked twice near the base of his spine. He had been on the road for 11 days straight, moving freight from Albuquerque to Tulsa and back again in a loop that paid well enough to ignore the fatigue settling into his joints like wet cement. He pushed through the glass doors into the parking lot where his Peterbilt sat under the yellow glow of the overhead lights, its chrome still dusty from the previous haul. The night air was cool and dry, carrying the faint smell of diesel and fried food from the diner next door. Asher climbed into the cab and fired up the engine, letting it rumble to life while he checked the mirrors and adjusted the seat. The clock on the dashboard read 11:51 p.m. He had 12 minutes now. He pulled out of the lot and merged onto the service road, keeping his speed steady as he navigated the empty streets toward the industrial zone on the far side of the city. The roads were almost deserted at this hour. Just a few scattered headlights from late-shift workers heading home and the occasional patrol car cruising through intersections with its lights off. The distribution center sat behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, its loading docks illuminated by harsh white floodlights that made everything look washed out and flat. Asher pulled up to the gate and rolled down his window as a security guard stepped out of the booth, clipboard in hand. The guard was older, maybe in his 60s, with a gray beard and a jacket 2 sizes too big for his frame. He glanced at the clipboard and then at Asher, nodding slowly. "You Lockwood?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel shifting in a bucket. Asher confirmed with a quick nod and handed over his CDL and the pickup authorization that Delphine had sent to his phone. The guard studied both documents under the beam of a small flashlight, his lips moving slightly as he read. After a moment, he handed them back and gestured toward the far end of the lot. "Bay 7, they got your trailer ready. Sealed and tagged. Don't mess with the locks." Asher thanked him and drove through the gate, following the painted lines on the asphalt until he reached the loading bay. The trailer was already sitting there, detached, and waiting. It was a standard 53-footer with no markings on the side, just plain white panels that reflected the floodlights in harsh streaks. A single orange seal hung from the rear doors, the kind with a serial number stamped into the plastic. Asher backed his rig into position and stepped out to connect the trailer, working through the familiar motions of securing the kingpin and running the air lines. As he worked, he noticed a man standing near the edge of the dock, watching him. The man wore a reflective vest over a flannel shirt and held a tablet in one hand, his face shadowed by the brim of a ball cap. He did not say anything, just stood there with his arms crossed, staring. Asher finished the hookup and walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. "This the load for eastbound?" he asked. The man nodded once and held out the tablet without looking up. "Sign here. Delivery address is in the system. Don't break the seal. Don't open the doors. Don't stop except for fuel." Asher took the tablet and scanned the document on the screen. The delivery address was listed as a warehouse in Little Rock, Arkansas, about 400 miles east on I-40. The weight was listed as 42,000 pounds, right in the middle range for mixed freight. The cargo description was blank, just a series of dashes where the details should have been. Asher frowned and looked up at the man. "What am I hauling?" he asked. The man finally met his eyes, and there was something flat and unreadable in his expression. "Sealed load. That is all you need to know. Sign the form and get moving. You're already behind schedule." Asher hesitated for a moment, then signed his name on the screen and handed the tablet back. He had hauled sealed loads before, usually high-value electronics or pharmaceuticals that companies did not want their drivers knowing too much about. It was standard procedure in the industry, nothing unusual. But something about the way the man spoke, the clipped tone and the lack of detail, left a thin film of unease in the back of Asher's mind. He walked back to the cab and climbed in, glancing once more at the sealed trailer in his mirrors before pulling out of the lot. The gate guard waved him through without a word, and Asher merged onto the access road that led to the interstate. The clock now read 12:03 a.m. He was officially running late, but only by a few minutes. Delphine would not care as long as he made up the time on the road. The entrance ramp to I-40 eastbound was empty, a long curve of asphalt that fed into the main highway like a vein connecting to an artery. Asher accelerated smoothly, feeling the weight of the trailer settle behind him as he reached cruising speed. The road ahead was dark and open, stretching out into the prairie night with nothing but occasional mile markers and the distant glow of small towns off to the south. For the first 30 miles, everything felt normal. The engine hummed steadily, the tires rolled smooth over the pavement, and the CB radio crackled with scattered chatter from other drivers making their way across the state. Asher kept his eyes on the road and his hands light on the wheel, letting muscle memory guide him through the long stretches of nothing. He passed a few cars heading west, their headlights flashing briefly in his mirrors before disappearing into the darkness behind him. The highway was wide and well-maintained here, 3 lanes in each direction, with a grassy median dividing the eastbound and westbound traffic. Asher stayed in the right lane, keeping a steady 65 miles per hour and watching for the reflective markers that indicated upcoming exits. It was just past the 40-mile mark, somewhere between Shawnee and Okima, when he first noticed the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the road noise and the low rumble of the engine. A soft metallic tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind him. Asher glanced at the mirrors, checking the trailer and the road, but there was nothing out of place. He turned down the radio and listened more carefully. The sound was still there, a steady series of taps, 3 or 4 in a row, then silence, then 3 or 4 more. It was not the kind of random clatter you get from loose straps or shifting cargo. This was deliberate, almost like someone knocking on metal from the inside. Asher felt a prickle of discomfort crawl up the back of his neck. He told himself it was just the load settling, something shifting in the trailer as the rig moved over uneven pavement. Sealed loads were packed tight, but there was always the possibility of something coming loose during transport. He kept driving, trying to ignore the sound, but it continued at irregular intervals, sometimes loud enough to make him glance over his shoulder, sometimes so faint he thought he might be imagining it. After another 10 miles, the tapping stopped. Asher exhaled slowly and turned the radio back up, letting the static-filled voices of the CB channel fill the cab. He was tired, that was all. Tired, and running on too much coffee, and not enough sleep. The mind played tricks when you spent too many hours alone on dark highways. The first way station appeared just past the 70-mile mark, a wide pull-off area with a small building and a set of scales designed to check the weight and documentation of commercial vehicles. Normally, these stations were staffed around the clock, especially on major interstates like I-40. But as Asher approached, he noticed that the lights in the building were off and the gates were closed. A handwritten sign had been taped to the entrance barrier. Closed for maintenance. Bypass and continue. Asher slowed down and read the sign again, frowning. Way stations did not usually close without advance notice, and they certainly did not post handwritten signs. It looked unofficial, almost improvised. He thought about pulling over to check his paperwork, but the sign said to bypass, so he followed the detour lane and merged back onto the highway. A few minutes later, his phone rang. The screen displayed Delphine's name, and Asher answered on the second ring, holding the phone to his ear with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. "Lockwood," he said. Delphine's voice came through clear and calm, the way it always did no matter the hour. "Hey, Asher, quick update. Your route just got changed. New delivery address came through about 10 minutes ago. You're going to need to take exit 221 instead of continuing straight through to Little Rock." Asher frowned and glanced at the GPS mounted on the dashboard. Exit 221 was not on his original route. It was a smaller highway that branched off to the north, cutting through a less traveled section of the state. "What is at 221?" he asked. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, just long enough to feel deliberate. Warehouse relocation. Client changed the drop-off point. It is all in the updated manifest. Should be in your email now. Asher pulled up his email on the phone and scrolled through the recent messages. There was nothing from Delphine, nothing from dispatch, just the usual junk and automated notifications. "I do not see anything," he said. Another pause. "It might take a few minutes to sync. Just follow the new route. Exit 221, then north on Highway 9 for about 60 miles. You will see the signs." Asher did not like the sound of this. Route changes were not uncommon, but they usually came through official channels with proper documentation. A last-minute phone call from a night dispatcher with no email confirmation felt off. "Delphine, can you send me the updated manifest again? I want to make sure I have the right address." The line crackled with static for a moment, and when Delphine spoke again, her voice sounded slightly distorted, like the signal was cutting in and out. "Just follow the route, Asher. Trust me on this. You are already behind schedule." The call ended before he could respond. Asher lowered the phone and stared at the road ahead, his jaw tightening. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the way the conversation had unfolded, the vague answers and the missing documentation. He thought about calling Delphine back, but the phone screen showed no recent calls, no record of the conversation that had just happened. Asher checked the call log twice, scrolling through the list of numbers, but Delphine's name was not there. The last call he had received was from a fuel station 3 days ago. His grip on the wheel tightened. Either the phone was glitching, or the call had never actually come from Delphine. He did not know which possibility worried him more. The highway stretched on, empty and dark. Asher kept his speed steady, his mind running through the possibilities. Sealed load, no cargo description, closed way station, phantom phone call. Each detail on its own could be explained away, but together they formed a pattern that made his instincts scream. He glanced at the trailer in the side mirror, watching the sealed doors rock gently with the motion of the rig. The orange seal was still intact, the serial number visible in the glow of the running lights. Whatever was in that trailer, someone wanted it moved quickly and quietly, with no questions asked and no detours. Asher had been driving long enough to know when a job felt wrong, and this one had crossed that line miles ago. He passed a sign for exit 221, the numbers glowing white in the headlights. The exit was less than 2 miles ahead. Asher eased off the gas and moved into the right lane, his pulse ticking up slightly. He did not know what he would find on Highway 9, but he was committed now. The rig rolled forward through the darkness, the sound of the tires on asphalt blending with the low hum of the engine. Behind him, faint and almost inaudible, The metallic tapping started again. The exit ramp curved away from the interstate in a long arc, dropping Asher down onto a 2-lane highway that cut north through flat farmland and scattered patches of scrub oak. Highway 9 was narrower than the interstate, with no shoulder to speak of and thick darkness pressing in from both sides where the headlights could not reach. Asher kept his speed around 50, watching the yellow center line unfold in front of him like a thread pulling him deeper into the night. There were no other vehicles on the road, no lights from farmhouses or gas stations, just the empty ribbon of asphalt and the occasional reflective marker glinting in the darkness. He checked his phone again, pulling up the email app and refreshing it twice. Still nothing from Delphine. No updated manifest. No delivery address. The GPS on the dashboard showed his current location as a thin blue line moving north along Highway 9, but the destination field was blank. Asher had programmed the original route to Little Rock before leaving Oklahoma City, but now the system had no endpoint, just the instruction to continue on the current road. He thought about pulling over and calling dispatch directly, using the main number instead of Delphine's cell, but something stopped him. If the phone call had been fake, if someone had spoofed Delphine's voice or hacked into the system somehow, then calling dispatch might tip them off that he was onto them. And if the call had been real, if this was a legitimate route change that just had not synced properly, then stopping to verify it would put him even further behind schedule. Asher decided to keep driving. He would follow Highway 9 for another 30 miles and see if any signs appeared indicating a warehouse or distribution center. If nothing showed up by then, he would pull over and reassess. The tapping sound from the trailer had stopped again, leaving just the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires crossing the seams in the pavement. Asher turned on the CB radio and cycled through the channels, listening for any chatter from other drivers in the area. Most of the channels were silent, just static and the occasional burst of interference. On Channel 19, he caught a fragment of conversation. Two voices talking over each other in a rapid exchange that cut out before he could make sense of it. He tried calling out, keying the mic and asking if anyone was monitoring the channel, but there was no response. The road continued north, passing through a small town that consisted of a closed gas station, a shuttered diner, and a handful of dark houses set back from the highway. Asher slowed as he rolled through the single intersection, checking the side streets for any signs of activity. Everything was still and empty, the kind of place that people left behind when better opportunities appeared elsewhere. A faded sign at the edge of town read, Hera, population 512. But Asher did not see a single light burning in any of the windows. He accelerated back up to 50 and left the town behind, the buildings disappearing into the rearview mirror like they had never existed at all. About 10 miles past Hera, the road began to climb slightly, rising up into low hills covered with dense stands of pine and cedar. The trees crowded close to the edges of the highway, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the stars. Asher's headlights cut through the darkness in narrow beams, illuminating the road just far enough ahead to stay on course. He noticed that the pavement here was in worse condition than on the interstate, with cracks and potholes that forced him to slow down and navigate carefully. The trailer bounced and swayed behind him, the weight shifting slightly with each uneven patch of road. Asher kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes locked on the yellow line, focusing on the mechanics of driving to keep his mind from wandering into uncomfortable territory. It was around 1:30 a.m. when he saw the first set of headlights. They appeared in his rearview mirror, distant and faint, just two small points of light far behind him on the highway. Asher watched them for a moment, gauging their speed and distance. The vehicle was moving faster than he was, closing the gap steadily but not aggressively. It could have been another truck or a late-night commuter heading home from a shift somewhere. Asher kept his speed consistent and waited to see if the vehicle would pass. As the minutes ticked by, the headlights grew closer, but they never quite caught up. They stayed at a fixed distance, maybe a quarter-mile back, matching his speed exactly. Asher tapped his brakes once, just a light touch to see if the vehicle would react. The headlights slowed immediately, maintaining the same gap. Asher felt a cold knot form in his chest. This was not random. Whoever was driving that vehicle was pacing him deliberately, keeping just far enough back to avoid being seen clearly but close enough to track his movements. He thought about the phantom phone call from Delphine, the route change, the sealed trailer with no cargo description. Now this. Someone was following him and they wanted him to know it. Asher reached for the CB mic and keyed it, keeping his voice calm and level. Breaker 19, this is eastbound freight on Highway 9 north of Hera. Anyone got eyes on a vehicle trailing about a quarter-mile back? He released the mic and waited. Static filled the cab, thick and heavy. No response. He tried again, this time on Channel 17, the emergency channel that most drivers monitored. This is a northbound rig on Highway 9 requesting confirmation on a vehicle behind me. Can anyone copy? The static crackled and hissed, and for a moment Asher thought he heard a voice underneath it, faint and distorted like someone speaking through layers of interference. But before he could make out any words, the transmission cut off and the channel went silent. Asher hung the mic back on its hook and glanced at the rearview mirror. The headlights were still there, steady and unblinking. He considered pulling over and confronting whoever was following him, but that felt like a bad idea. If this was some kind of setup, stopping would give them exactly what they wanted. Better to keep moving, stay unpredictable, and look for a place with people and lights where he could call for help if needed. The highway continued to climb, winding through the hills in long curves that required constant adjustments to the steering. Asher shifted down a gear to maintain traction on the steeper sections, feeling the engine labor slightly under the load. The trees grew thicker here, pressing in so close that their branches scraped against the sides of the trailer with a sound like fingernails on metal. He checked the mirrors again. The headlights were still there, closer now, maybe 300 yards back. Asher could make out the shape of the vehicle in the glow of his running lights. It was a dark-colored SUV, similar to the ones used by highway patrol, but there were no light bars on the roof and no markings on the doors. Just a plain black SUV with tinted windows and high beams that never dimmed. Asher's mind raced through his options. He could try to outrun the SUV, push the rig up to 70 or 80, and hope the trailer stayed stable on the curves, but that was risky, and it would burn through fuel faster than he could afford. He could pull off onto a side road and try to lose them in the back roads, but most of the side roads around here were gravel or dirt, too narrow for a 53-foot trailer. Or he could keep driving straight, maintain his speed, and see if the SUV eventually gave up and turned around. None of the options felt good, but the third one seemed the least likely to get him killed. He kept driving. The road leveled out as it crested the top of the hills and began descending into a broad valley. Asher could see the lights of another small town in the distance, maybe 5 or 6 miles ahead. It looked bigger than Hera, with clusters of streetlights and what appeared to be a main street running parallel to the highway. If he could make it to that town, he could pull into a gas station or a truck stop and get around other people. Safety in numbers. The SUV would have to back off or risk being seen by witnesses. Asher pressed down slightly on the gas, increasing his speed to 55. The SUV matched him immediately, closing the gap to 200 yards. Asher pushed it to 60. The SUV stayed locked in position, neither gaining nor falling back. The tapping sound started again, louder this time. 3 sharp knocks, a pause, then 3 more. It was coming from the trailer, somewhere near the front section just behind the cab. Asher's jaw clenched. He wanted to stop and check the cargo, verify that the seal was still intact and that nothing had shifted inside. But stopping now, with the SUV breathing down his neck, was not an option. He would have to wait until he reached the town and hope that whatever was making the noise did not get worse. The knocking continued in irregular bursts, sometimes loud enough to make him flinch, sometimes so faint he had to hold his breath to hear it. Each time it happened, Asher's eyes flicked to the mirrors, checking the seal on the trailer doors. The orange tag was still there, unbroken, swaying slightly in the wind. The town ahead was called Seminole, according to a green highway sign that appeared in the headlights. Population 7,488. Asher felt a small surge of relief. A town that size would have a gas station, maybe even a 24-hour convenience store. He took the first exit into town and followed the main road toward the center, passing closed storefronts and dark residential streets. The SUV followed him off the highway, maintaining the same distance. Asher spotted a brightly lit gas station on the left side of the road, a national chain with multiple pumps and a small convenience store attached. He pulled into the lot and swung the rig into the truck parking area at the far end, away from the pumps. The SUV did not follow him into the lot. It slowed as it passed the entrance, then continued down the main road and disappeared around a corner. Asher killed the engine and sat in the cab, breathing hard. His hands were shaking slightly, and he gripped the wheel until the shaking stopped. He waited for a full minute, watching the road through the windshield, but the SUV did not reappear. Maybe they had given up. Maybe they realized he was not going to stop in the middle of nowhere and had decided to try a different approach. Or maybe they were circling around, looking for another way to box him in. Asher did not know, and he was not going to sit there and find out. He grabbed his phone and stepped out of the cab, locking the doors behind him. The air outside was cool and still, carrying the faint smell of gasoline and asphalt. The gas station was quiet, with only one other vehicle in the lot, a sedan parked near the entrance to the store. Asher walked toward the convenience store, keeping his eyes on the road and the surrounding area. The store was small and brightly lit, with rows of snacks and drinks visible through the front windows. A young clerk stood behind the counter staring at a phone and barely glancing up as Asher pushed through the door. The interior was empty except for the clerk, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a faint electrical hum. Asher walked to the back of the store and grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler, then approached the counter. The clerk looked up, bored and tired, and scanned the bottle without saying a word. Asher paid in cash and asked if there was a payphone nearby. The clerk shook his head. "Nobody uses those anymore. You got a cell, right?" Asher nodded and stepped back outside, opening the bottle and taking a long drink. He pulled out his phone and tried calling Delphine's number directly, bypassing the text system. The call rang twice, then went to voicemail. Delphine's recorded voice played through the speaker, calm and professional, asking him to leave a message. Asher hung up and tried the main dispatch line. It rang 6 times before an automated system picked up, informing him that the office was closed and to call back during business hours. Asher cursed under his breath and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He was on his own. Whatever was happening, whatever this job had turned into, he was going to have to figure it out without backup. He walked back to the rig and circled around to the rear of the trailer, pulling out a small flashlight from his jacket pocket. The seal on the doors was still intact, the serial number clear and unbroken. Asher aimed the flashlight at the number and compared it to the paperwork he had signed back at the distribution center. The number on the seal read 74829. The number on the paperwork read 74892. Asher stared at the mismatch, his stomach dropping. Either someone had written the wrong number on the paperwork, or the seal on the trailer was not the original one. He checked the paperwork again, reading it carefully under the beam of the flashlight. The seal number was printed, not handwritten, which meant it had come from the system. The seal on the trailer was wrong. Asher stepped back and looked at the trailer, his mind racing. Someone had switched the seal, either at the distribution center or somewhere along the route. That meant the trailer had been opened, the cargo accessed or tampered with, and then resealed with a different lock. And whoever had done it had made sure the numbers did not match, probably to cover their tracks or to signal something to someone else down the line. Asher felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. He had been hauling a compromised load for the past 100 miles, with no idea what was actually inside or who was involved. The fake phone call, the route change, the SUV following him, it was all connected. Someone wanted this trailer to reach a specific destination, and they were willing to manipulate and intimidate him to make it happen. He walked back to the cab and climbed inside, locking the doors and pulling the curtain across the back window. He sat in the driver's seat and stared at the dashboard, trying to think. He could abandon the load right here, unhook the trailer and drive away, but that would leave him without answers and possibly in legal trouble if the cargo turned out to be illegal. He could call the police and report the seal mismatch, but without proof of who had switched it or why, he would just be another paranoid trucker wasting their time. Or he could keep driving, follow the route to wherever it led, and see what was waiting for him at the end. That option felt the most dangerous, but it was also the only one that might give him some clarity. Asher started the engine and pulled out of the gas station, merging back onto the main road. He did not return to Highway 9. Instead, he took a different route, heading east on a parallel road that would eventually connect back to I-40. If someone was tracking him, changing the route might throw them off. He drove slowly, checking the mirrors every few seconds, watching for the SUV or any other vehicles that seemed out of place. The road was empty, lined with farmland and the occasional house set back from the pavement. Asher kept the CB radio on, cycling through the channels and listening for any chatter. Most of the channels were still silent, but on Channel 9 he picked up a faint transmission. A man's voice speaking in short, clipped sentences. Unit 4 to dispatch. Northbound load confirmed. Seal discrepancy noted. Proceed to secondary location. The voice cut off, and the channel went silent. Asher's blood ran cold. Unit 4. Seal discrepancy. Secondary location, they were talking about him. Whoever was tracking him had multiple units, and they knew about the seal mismatch, which meant they were the ones who had switched it. Asher gripped the wheel tighter and pushed the rig up to 65, his heart pounding in his chest. He did not know where the secondary location was, but he was not going to find out by following their instructions. He needed to get off this road, find a place to hide the rig, and figure out his next move before they closed in. The tapping sound came back, louder than before. This time it was continuous, a rapid series of knocks that echoed through the cab like someone hammering on the inside of the trailer. Asher glanced at the mirrors, half expecting to see the doors swing open and something crawl out. But the seal held, the doors stayed shut, and the knocking continued without pause. Asher drove east for another 20 minutes, pushing the rig harder than he normally would on unfamiliar roads. The knocking from the trailer had settled into a pattern now. 3 sharp impacts followed by silence, then 3 more, like someone testing the strength of the walls from the inside. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on finding a place to stop where he could think clearly and make a plan. The parallel road he had taken was darker than Highway 9, with fewer streetlights and long stretches where the only illumination came from his headlights cutting through the blackness. He passed through 2 more small towns, both of them silent and shuttered for the night, and saw no other vehicles on the road. Around 2:15 a.m., the road curved back toward the interstate, merging onto an access ramp that fed into I-40 eastbound. Asher hesitated at the merge point, checking his mirrors for any sign of the SUV or other pursuit vehicles. The highway was mostly empty at this hour, just a handful of scattered taillights from other trucks moving through the night. He accelerated onto the interstate and settled into the right lane, keeping his speed at a steady 60. The familiar rumble of the highway beneath the tires was almost comforting after the narrow back roads, and Asher allowed himself a brief moment of relief. At least here he had options, multiple lanes to maneuver in and exits every few miles if he needed to bail. The relief did not last long. About 10 miles after merging onto I-40, Asher saw a sign indicating a way station ahead, mandatory entry for all commercial vehicles. His chest tightened. Way stations meant inspections, paperwork checks, and questions he was not prepared to answer. If the authorities discovered the seal mismatch or started asking about the cargo, he would have to explain a situation he barely understood himself. But bypassing a mandatory way station was a serious violation, one that could result in heavy fines and the suspension of his CDL. He was trapped between compliance and self-preservation, and neither option felt safe. As he approached the way station entrance, Asher noticed something strange. The overhead signs that normally displayed instructions for entering trucks were dark, their screens blank and lifeless. The weighing platform itself was visible in the distance, illuminated by dim floodlights, but there were no vehicles on it and no personnel moving around the inspection area. Asher slowed to 30 miles per hour and guided the rig onto the entrance ramp, following the painted arrows towards the scales. The station looked operational from a distance, but as he drew closer, he could see that the main building was dark, its windows unlit and its doors closed. A single light burned above the entrance, casting a weak yellow glow over the empty parking lot. Asher brought the rig to a stop just before the scales and put it in neutral, letting the engine idle while he surveyed the area. There was no one here, no inspectors, no patrol vehicles, no other trucks waiting in line. The station was completely deserted. He checked the time on his phone. 2:27 a.m. Way stations on major interstates like I-40 were supposed to operate around the clock, especially during peak freight hours. Something was very wrong. Asher thought about the earlier station that had been closed with a handwritten sign, and now this one. Dark and empty, but still technically open. It felt deliberate, like someone was clearing the path ahead of him, removing obstacles and witnesses. He was about to shift back into gear and leave when he noticed a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper on the driver's side. Asher froze, his hand hovering over the gear shift. He had not seen anyone approach the truck, and there were no other vehicles in the lot. The paper had not been there when he pulled in. He was certain of that. He stared at it for a long moment, trying to decide whether to get out and retrieve it or just drive away and leave it behind. Curiosity won out over caution. He turned off the engine, pocketed the keys, and climbed down from the cab. The night air was colder now, carrying a damp chill that seeped through his jacket and made him shiver. Asher walked around to the front of the truck and pulled the paper from under the wiper blade. It was a standard inspection notice, the kind that DOT officials left on trucks that needed follow-up checks or had minor violations. But this one was different. The header at the top of the page was blank, no station name or badge number, and the text below was handwritten in neat block letters. It read, "Proceed to mile marker 139. Exit north. Deliver as instructed. Do not deviate." There was no signature, no official stamp, just the message and a small notation at the bottom. Seal intact, verified. Asher's hands shook as he read the note again. Whoever had written this knew about the seal, knew that he had discovered the mismatch, and was telling him it did not matter. They wanted him to continue to mile marker 139, wherever that was, and complete the delivery. The casual certainty of the message was more frightening than any threat. It implied that he had no choice, that his movements were being tracked and controlled, and that resisting would be pointless. Asher crumpled the paper in his fist and looked around the empty way station, half expecting to see someone watching him from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the dark building and the silent highway stretching away into the distance. He climbed back into the cab and locked the doors, his mind racing. Mile marker 139 was about 40 miles ahead, maybe 30 minutes at highway speed. If he followed the instructions and took the exit north, he would be heading into even more isolated territory, away from the main interstate and into back roads where help would be hard to find. But if he ignored the note and kept driving east toward Little Rock, whoever was orchestrating this would know immediately. They had already demonstrated their ability to track him, intercept his communications, and plant messages on his truck without being seen. Running would only delay the confrontation, not prevent it. Asher started the engine and pulled out of the way station, merging back onto I-40. He drove in silence, the CB radio turned off, and the headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. The knocking from the trailer had stopped again, leaving only the steady hum of the tires and the occasional gust of wind buffeting the side of the rig. Asher kept his eyes on the mile markers as they appeared in the headlights and disappeared behind him, counting down the distance to 139. Each marker felt like a step closer to something he could not quite name, a threshold he was about to cross whether he wanted to or not. At mile marker 145, he passed a rest area on the right side of the highway. It was small and poorly lit with just a few parking spaces and a pair of concrete picnic tables. Asher considered pulling in and calling for help, but the memory of the phantom phone call and the disconnected dispatch line stopped him. He did not know who he could trust, and reaching out to the wrong person might make things worse. He kept driving, his jaw clenched and his hands tight on the wheel. Mile marker 139 appeared in the headlights at exactly 2:58 a.m. The exit was marked by a faded green sign that read, County Road 47, North, no services. Asher slowed and took the exit, guiding the rig onto a narrow 2-lane road that curved away from the interstate and into dense forest. The pavement here was cracked and uneven, with weeds growing through the gaps and no center line to mark the lanes. Asher shifted down and reduced his speed to 40, watching the road carefully for potholes or debris. The trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky and made the headlights feel inadequate. He drove north for about 10 miles, passing no other vehicles and seeing no signs of civilization. The road climbed gradually, winding through low hills covered in thick underbrush. Asher checked his phone for a signal, but the screen showed no bars and no data connection. He was completely cut off now, alone on a road that did not appear on his GPS and heading toward a destination he knew nothing about. The fear that had been simmering in his chest since the gas station in Seminole was now a steady burn, making his breath shallow and his palms sweat. At the top of a long rise, the road leveled out and opened into a clearing. Asher saw lights ahead, a cluster of floodlights illuminating a large open area surrounded by chain-link fencing. He slowed to a crawl and approached cautiously, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The clearing contained what looked like an old way station, similar to the one he had passed earlier, but much older and more dilapidated. The building was a single-story structure made of cinder blocks, with boarded-up windows and a rusted metal roof. The weighing platform was still there, though it was covered in dirt and debris, and the scale mechanism looked like it had not been used in decades. Asher pulled the rig to a stop about 50 yards from the building and left the engine running. He sat in the cab, staring at the scene through the windshield. There was one other vehicle in the clearing, a dark SUV parked near the entrance to the building. It was the same SUV that had followed him on Highway 9, he was almost certain. The headlights were off, but the engine was running, a faint plume of exhaust rising from the tailpipe. Asher watched the SUV for a full minute, waiting for someone to get out or signal him, but nothing happened. The vehicle just sat there, idling in the shadows. He considered backing up and driving away, but before he could shift into reverse, a man stepped out from the side of the building. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, with a ball cap pulled low over his face. The man walked toward the truck slowly, his hands visible and empty. Asher locked the doors and rolled down the window just a crack, enough to hear, but not enough for anyone to reach through. The man stopped about 10 feet from the driver's side door and looked up at Asher. Even in the dim light, Asher could see that the man's expression was calm and businesslike, not threatening, but not friendly either. "You Lockwood?" the man asked, his voice flat and uninflected. Asher did not answer immediately. He studied the man's face, looking for any identifying features or signs of law enforcement. There were none. The man could have been anyone, a contractor, a dispatcher, a criminal. "Who are you?" Asher asked, keeping his tone neutral. The man did not smile or offer a name. He simply gestured toward the building behind him. "Delivery point. You got a load for us. Back it up to the platform and we will take it from here." Asher shook his head. "I need to see some ID first, and I need to verify the delivery address with my dispatcher." The man's expression did not change. "Your dispatcher sent you here. You know that already. The seal on your trailer is compromised. You have been hauling a rerouted load for the past 3 hours. Either you finish the job, or you deal with the consequences of breaking a sealed contract." Asher felt a surge of anger cut through the fear. "I did not break anything. Someone switched the seal back in Oklahoma City. I want to know who and why." The man shrugged. "Does not matter. What matters is you are here now, and the load needs to be transferred. You can cooperate, or you can make this harder than it needs to be. Your choice." Asher glanced at the SUV, then back at the man. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, stuck on a dark road in the middle of nowhere with no backup and no clear way out. But something in the man's tone, the casual certainty that Asher would comply, sparked a stubborn resistance in him. He had been a trucker for 12 years, hauling everything from furniture to hazardous materials, and he had never once delivered a load without proper documentation and a verified address. He was not about to start now, no matter how much pressure they applied. "I am not unloading anything until I see official paperwork," Asher said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "You want this load, you show me a bill of lading with a signature and a company name. Otherwise, I am driving out of here and reporting this whole situation to the authorities." The man stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked back towards the building without saying another word. Asher watched him disappear through the doorway, leaving the clearing silent except for the idle of the truck engine and the faint hum of the SUV. Asher's hands were shaking again, and he gripped the wheel to steady them. He did not know if he had just made the situation better or worse, but he had drawn a line, and now he would have to see what happened next. Minutes passed. Asher kept his eyes on the building, watching for any sign of movement. The floodlights cast harsh shadows across the clearing, making it difficult to see into the darker corners where the light did not reach. He thought about calling out on the CB radio, trying to reach someone, anyone, who might be monitoring the channels. But the radio had been silent for hours, and he doubted anyone would respond now. He was alone, and he was going to have to handle this on his own. The man emerged from the building carrying a folder. He walked back to the truck and held it up for Asher to see. "Bill of lading," he said. Company name, signature, delivery address. Everything you asked for. Asher hesitated, then cracked the window a bit wider and took the folder. He opened it and scanned the documents inside. The bill of lading was printed on official-looking letterhead, with a company logo at the top that Asher did not recognize. The cargo was listed as industrial equipment, and the delivery address was this location, the old way station on County Road 47. The signature at the bottom was illegible, just a scrawled initial that could have belonged to anyone. Asher looked up at the man. "Who signed this?" The man shrugged. "Does it matter? You got your paperwork. Now back the trailer up and let us unload." Asher stared at the document, his mind working through the implications. The paperwork was fake, or at least hastily fabricated, designed to give him just enough cover to justify completing the delivery. If he refused now, he would be in violation of his contract, and whoever was behind this operation would have legal grounds to come after him. But if he complied, he would be complicit in whatever illegal activity was unfolding here. Neither option was good, but one of them kept him alive long enough to figure out what to do next. He handed the folder back through the window and shifted the rig into reverse. The man stepped aside, and Asher began backing the trailer toward the loading platform, using the mirrors to guide himself. The platform was old and cracked, but it looked sturdy enough to support the weight of the trailer. Asher aligned the rear doors with the edge of the platform and set the parking brake. He climbed out of the cab, his legs stiff from hours of sitting, and walked to the back of the trailer. The man was already there, along with two others who had emerged from the building. They were all dressed similarly, dark clothing and ball caps, their faces shadowed and unreadable. One of the men produced a pair of bolt cutters and approached the seal on the trailer doors. Asher watched as he cut through the plastic tag, letting it fall to the ground. The doors swung open, and the interior of the trailer was revealed. Asher expected to see crates or pallets, the usual contents of a freight load. Instead, the trailer was nearly empty. There were only 3 wooden crates stacked in the center, each one about the size of a small refrigerator. The rest of the space was bare, the walls lined with scratches and dents that had not been there before. The men moved quickly, using a pallet jack to roll the crates out of the trailer and onto the platform. Asher stood off to the side, watching them work. None of them spoke, and none of them looked at him. They moved with practiced efficiency, like they had done this many times before. Within 10 minutes, all 3 crates were unloaded and stacked near the entrance to the building. The man who had spoken to Asher earlier approached him again, holding out a clipboard. "Sign here," he said, confirming delivery. Asher took the clipboard and looked at the form. It was a standard delivery receipt, but the company name at the top was different from the one on the bill of lading. He pointed this out, and the man waved it off. "Clerical error, just sign." Asher hesitated, then signed his name at the bottom of the page. As soon as the pen left the paper, the man took the clipboard back and walked away without another word. The other 2 men had already disappeared into the building with the crates, and within moments Asher was alone again in the clearing. He closed the trailer doors and walked back to the cab, his mind numb. The SUV was still idling near the building, but no one had gotten in or out. Asher climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, pulling forward and away from the platform. He navigated the rig back onto the narrow road and headed south, retracing the route he had taken to get here. As he drove, he glanced once in the rearview mirror and saw the floodlights of the old way station disappearing behind the trees. The knocking from the trailer was gone now, replaced by an unsettling silence. Asher drove south on County Road 47 with the empty trailer rattling behind him, lighter now without the weight of the cargo. The road seemed different heading back, narrower somehow, with sharper curves and deeper shadows. He kept his speed low, navigating by instinct more than sight, his headlights barely penetrating the wall of trees on either side. The adrenaline that had kept him sharp during the confrontation at the way station was beginning to fade, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that made his hands feel heavy on the wheel and his eyelids threatened to close. He checked his phone again. Still no signal. The GPS was useless this far off the main highways, showing only a blank screen with a spinning loading icon that never resolved into an actual map. Asher estimated he had driven about 8 miles from the old way station when he noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. There were no headlights behind him, no vehicles following, but the road itself looked different. The pavement that had been cracked and uneven on the way up now appeared smooth and freshly paved, the white edge lines crisp and bright in the glow of his taillights. Asher frowned and glanced at the road ahead. It was still the same deteriorated surface he remembered, full of potholes and patches. He looked back at the mirror. Smooth pavement. He looked forward again. Broken asphalt. Asher slowed to a crawl and leaned toward the side mirror, trying to get a better angle on the road behind him. The pavement flickered, shifting between new and old like a film reel skipping frames. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. When he looked again, the road was back to its broken state, exactly as it had been on the way up. Asher told himself it was fatigue, that his brain was playing tricks after too many hours awake and too much stress. But the doubt lingered, a cold whisper in the back of his mind that suggested something else was happening, something he did not have the language to explain. The road finally reconnected with I-40 around 4:15 a.m. Asher merged onto the eastbound lanes and felt a small measure of relief as the familiar rhythm of the interstate settled around him. There were more vehicles here now, a few early morning commuters and a handful of other trucks beginning their routes. The sky to the east was just beginning to lighten, a faint gray line separating the horizon from the darkness overhead. Asher drove with the flow of traffic, keeping his speed at a steady 65 and trying to process everything that had happened over the past few hours. He needed to report what he had seen, the seal switch, the fake phone call, the forced delivery at the abandoned way station. But who would he report it to? The local police would want evidence, documentation, something concrete to justify an investigation. All Asher had was a crumpled note from a deserted way station and a story that sounded like paranoia or exhaustion. Delphine Mercer would be back online in a few hours when the day shift started. But if she had been the one making the fake call, or if someone was using her credentials to manipulate him, going to her directly could make things worse. Asher felt trapped in a situation with no clear exit, no authority he could trust, and no way to prove what had happened. He pulled off at a rest area just past mile marker 180, needing to stretch his legs and clear his head. The rest area was small but well lit, with a parking lot that could hold maybe a dozen vehicles and a cinder block building that housed restrooms and vending machines. Asher parked in a spot near the entrance and killed the engine, sitting in the silence for a moment before climbing out. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet grass and diesel exhaust. A few other trucks were parked in the lot, their drivers either sleeping in the cabs or moving around outside doing pre-trip inspections. Asher walked to the back of his trailer and checked the doors. They were still closed, the latch secure even without the seal. He opened them anyway, swinging the heavy panels wide to reveal the empty interior. The scratches and dents he had noticed earlier were still there, long gouges in the metal walls that looked fresh. Asher stepped up into the trailer and ran his hand along one of the scratches. It was deep, cutting through the paint and into the metal beneath. The pattern was irregular, not the kind of damage you would get from cargo shifting or straps rubbing. It looked deliberate, almost frantic, like something had been clawing at the walls from the inside. Asher climbed back down and closed the doors, his unease deepening. He walked around to the side of the trailer and examined the exterior panels. There were no dents or scratches on the outside, no signs of impact or damage. Whatever had caused the marks on the interior had done so from within the trailer itself. Asher thought about the knocking sounds he had heard during the drive, the rhythmic tapping that had followed him for miles. He had assumed it was cargo shifting or loose straps, but now he was not so sure. The 3 crates he had delivered were small, too small to account for the 42,000 pounds listed on the original paperwork, which meant there had been something else in the trailer, something heavy enough to register on the weight estimate, but not visible when the doors were opened. He returned to the cab and pulled out his phone, checking for a signal. 2 bars appeared on the screen, weak but functional. Asher opened his email and scrolled through the messages looking for anything from Delphine or the dispatch office. There was nothing new, just the same automated notifications and spam he had seen before. He tried calling Delphine's number again. This time the call connected, ringing 3 times before she picked up. "Lockwood?" Her voice was clear and alert, the same professional tone he had always known. "Yeah, it's me," Asher said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to talk to you about the load I picked up last night." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "What load? I didn't assign you anything last night. You were supposed to be off duty until this morning." Asher felt his stomach drop. "You called me at 11:47 p.m., told me to pick up a sealed load from the distribution center on the east side of Oklahoma City, eastbound to Little Rock." Another pause, longer this time. "Asher, I didn't call you last night. I clocked out at 6 p.m. and went home. Are you sure it was me?" Asher closed his eyes, the pieces clicking into place. "Someone used your voice or your number, I don't know, but I picked up a load, drove it to an old way station on County Road 47, and delivered it to people who had no business being there." Delphine's tone shifted, concern creeping in at the edges. "Asher, you need to report this. Call the state police and tell them what happened. If someone is impersonating dispatch and routing drivers to unauthorized locations, that's a serious issue." Asher nodded, even though she could not see him. "I will. I just needed to verify with you first." He ended the call and sat in the cab, staring at the phone screen. The conversation had confirmed what he already suspected, but it did not make him feel any better. Someone had gone to significant effort to manipulate him into making that delivery, using voice synthesis or recording technology to fake a call from his dispatcher. And they had done it well enough that he had not questioned it until it was too late. Asher started the engine and pulled back onto the interstate, heading east toward Little Rock. He would file a report with the state police when he reached the city, give them all the details he could remember, and hope that someone took it seriously enough to investigate. But even as he drove, he could not shake the feeling that it would not matter. Whoever had orchestrated this operation had covered their tracks too well, leaving no physical evidence and no witnesses except Asher himself. And a single trucker's testimony, unsupported by documentation or corroboration, would be easy to dismiss as a mistake or a hallucination brought on by fatigue. The sun was fully up by the time Asher reached the outskirts of Little Rock, the sky a pale blue streaked with thin clouds. He followed the signs to the nearest state police barracks and pulled into the parking lot, backing the rig into a corner spot where it would not block traffic. The building was a low brick structure with a glass front door and a flagpole out front. Asher walked inside and approached the reception desk, where a uniformed officer sat behind a computer screen. The officer looked up, his expression neutral and professional. "Can I help you?" Asher explained the situation as clearly as he could, starting with the midnight pickup and ending with the delivery at the old way station. The officer listened without interrupting, taking notes on a pad of paper. When Asher finished, the officer asked a few follow-up questions about the location of the way station, the description of the men he had encountered, and the details of the cargo. Asher answered as best he could, but many of the specifics were fuzzy now, blurred by exhaustion and the surreal quality of the experience. The officer nodded and told him someone would look into it, that they would send a unit to check out the location on County Road 47 and see if there was any evidence of illegal activity. Asher thanked him and walked back to the truck, knowing, even as he did, that nothing would come of it. The old way station would be empty by now, the crates gone, the men vanished. There would be no paperwork trail, no security footage, nothing to prove that the delivery had ever taken place. He climbed into the cab and sat there for a long time, staring at the dashboard and trying to decide what to do next. He could go back to the distribution center in Oklahoma City and demand answers, but they would likely deny any knowledge of the sealed load or claim it had been a clerical error. He could contact the company whose logo had been on the bill of lading, but a quick internet search on his phone showed no results for the name, suggesting it was either fake or so obscure as to be untraceable. In the end, Asher did what he always did when a job went sideways. He filed the incident with his company's safety office, documented everything in a written statement, and moved on to the next load. There were bills to pay and miles to cover, and dwelling on things he could not change would not help. But the experience stayed with him, a persistent unease that colored every job he took for weeks afterward. He started checking seals more carefully, verifying delivery addresses with multiple sources, and avoiding routes that took him too far off the main highways. He installed a dash cam that recorded continuously front and rear, and he kept the footage backed up to a cloud server in case anything unusual happened again. 3 weeks after the incident, Asher received a package in the mail at his home address. It was a small, padded envelope with no return address, postmarked from somewhere in eastern Oklahoma. Inside was a single item, an orange seal tag with the number 74892 stamped into the plastic. It was the original seal from the trailer, the one that should have been on the doors when he picked up the load in Oklahoma City. Someone had sent it to him, either as a confirmation that they knew who he was and where he lived, or as a strange kind of proof that what he had experienced was real. Asher stared at the seal for a long time, then placed it in a drawer in his desk and tried to forget about it. But forgetting was harder than he expected. Over the following months, Asher started noticing small things that felt wrong, details that did not add up. He would receive dispatch calls that came through at odd hours, only to have no record of them in his call log. He would pass way stations that were supposed to be open but sat dark and empty, with no explanation from the authorities. And once, while driving through Missouri on a late-night run, he saw a dark SUV pacing him in the rearview mirror for nearly 50 miles before it finally turned off at an unmarked exit. Asher never spoke about the sealed load to other drivers. He knew how it would sound, how easily the story could be dismissed as stress or paranoia. But he also knew what he had seen and heard, and he knew that somewhere out there, people were using the trucking industry as a cover for operations that existed in the spaces between official records and legitimate business. The roads were full of sealed trailers and midnight deliveries, and most of them were exactly what they claimed to be. But some were not, and the drivers who hauled them rarely asked questions because questions led to complications, and complications led to lost jobs and ruined reputations. Asher Lockwood kept driving, kept hauling freight across the country, kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the wheel. But he never took another sealed load, no matter how much it paid or how urgent the dispatcher made it sound. And every time he passed mile marker 139 on I-40, he looked away from the exit sign and focused on the road ahead, refusing to acknowledge the narrow turnoff that led north into the trees. Some deliveries, he had learned, were not meant to be completed, and some roads were better left untraveled, no matter how insistent the voice on the other end of the phone might be. The seal tag stayed in his desk drawer, a small piece of orange plastic that weighed almost nothing but felt heavier every time he thought about it. Asher never threw it away, and he never looked at it again. It was a reminder, a tangible piece of evidence from a night that officially never happened, and it served as proof that he had not imagined the whole thing. But proof for whom and to what end he could not say. The roads kept rolling, the miles kept adding up, and the questions remained unanswered, lost somewhere in the dark hours between midnight and dawn. Cormac Ellery had been hauling refrigerated loads for 9 years, long enough to know that temperature control was everything. A degree too warm and pharmaceuticals degraded, frozen food thawed, and entire shipments became worthless. A degree too cold and products froze solid, packaging cracked, and insurance claims piled up faster than you could explain what went wrong. The margin for error was thin, and Cormac had built his reputation on never missing that margin. His reefer unit was top of the line, regularly serviced, and monitored by 3 separate sensors that fed real-time data to both his dashboard display and his phone. He checked those numbers more often than he checked his mirrors. The load he picked up in Amarillo on a Tuesday evening was routine, at least on paper. Frozen vegetables bound for a distribution center in Omaha, 26 pallets packed tight and chilled to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The manifest listed the contents in meticulous detail. Corn, green beans, mixed vegetables, all processed and packaged by a company Cormac had hauled for before. The pickup went smoothly, the warehouse crew loading the pallets with practiced efficiency while Cormac supervised and verified the count. By the time he pulled out of the facility at 8:30 p.m., the reefer unit was humming steadily, and the temperature gauge read minus 9.8 degrees, well within acceptable range. Cormac merged onto US 83 northbound, a long, straight highway that cut through the Texas Panhandle and into Oklahoma before eventually reaching Nebraska. It was one of his preferred routes, wide open and lightly traveled, with long stretches where you could settle into a rhythm and let the miles roll by. The night was clear and cold, the kind of late autumn evening where the temperature dropped fast after sunset and frost formed on the grass along the roadside. Cormac had the cab heater running low, just enough to take the edge off, and a thermos of coffee wedged into the cup holder. The radio was tuned to a country station out of Oklahoma City, playing old songs that he half remembered from his childhood. For the first 2 hours, everything was normal. The reefer unit maintained temperature without fluctuation. The engine ran smooth, and the road ahead was empty except for the occasional set of headlights passing in the opposite direction. Cormac stopped once at a truck stop just south of the Oklahoma border to refuel and check the load. He walked around the trailer, listening to the compressor and feeling the cold air venting from the refrigeration unit. Everything sounded right. No unusual noises or vibrations. He climbed back into the cab and continued north, crossing into Oklahoma around 11 p.m. The temperature anomaly started just past mile marker 47, about 40 miles north of the border. Cormac was watching the road and sipping coffee when his phone chimed with an alert. He glanced at the screen mounted on the dashboard. The reefer temperature had dropped to minus 11 degrees. Cormac frowned and tapped the screen to bring up the detailed readout. All 3 sensors showed the same reading, and the compressor was running at normal capacity. A 1-degree drop was not cause for alarm, but it was unusual. Reefer units were designed to maintain steady temperatures, adjusting the compressor output automatically to compensate for external conditions. Spontaneous drops like this typically indicated a sensor malfunction or a problem with the thermostat. Cormac pulled up the diagnostic menu and ran a quick systems check. Everything came back green, no faults detected. He watched the temperature for another few minutes, waiting to see if it would stabilize or continue dropping. The reading held at -11 degrees for about 5 miles, then ticked back up to -10. Cormac relaxed slightly, chalking it up to a brief fluctuation caused by wind chill or a dip in the external temperature. He made a mental note to have the sensors recalibrated when he got back to his home base, but for now, the load was safe and the unit was functioning. 10 miles later, the temperature dropped again. This time, it went from -10 to -12 in the span of a single mile. Cormac sat up straighter, his attention fully focused on the display. The compressor was running harder now, cycling more frequently to maintain the set point. But instead of stabilizing, the temperature continued to drift lower. -12.5, -13, -13.2. Cormac cursed under his breath and tapped the screen to access the manual override. He adjusted the set point up by 2 degrees, hoping to coax the system back into balance. The compressor responded immediately, throttling back and allowing the temperature to rise. But it did not rise. The reading stayed locked at -13.2 degrees, unmoving despite the reduced compressor output. Cormac stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. If the compressor was running at lower capacity, the temperature should climb, even slowly. The fact that it was holding steady suggested either that the external conditions were impossibly cold or that something was wrong with the refrigeration system itself. Cormac checked the external temperature display. It read 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Cool, but nowhere near cold enough to cause this kind of anomaly. He pulled over at the next wide spot in the road, a gravel turnout that overlooked a shallow ravine filled with scrub brush. The highway was empty in both directions, just a dark ribbon of asphalt cutting through flat prairie land. Cormac grabbed his flashlight and jacket and climbed out of the cab, walking back to the trailer. The reefer unit was mounted on the front wall of the trailer, a large metal box with vents and a control panel. Cormac opened the panel and checked the readouts. The compressor was running, the fans were spinning, and the coolant levels were normal. He closed the panel and walked around to the rear doors, placing his hand against the metal. It was ice cold, almost painful to touch, colder than it should have been even with the temperature drop. Cormac unlocked the rear doors and cracked them open just a few inches, letting the cold air spill out. A cloud of vapor poured through the gap, thick and white like fog. The interior of the trailer was dark, illuminated only by the beam of his flashlight. He could see the pallets stacked neatly inside, wrapped in plastic and secured with straps. Everything looked normal. Cormac closed the doors and locked them again, then returned to the cab. The temperature display now read -14 degrees. It had dropped another point while he was outside. Cormac sat in the driver's seat and pulled out his phone, searching for the customer service number for the reefer unit manufacturer. It was past midnight now, but most companies had 24-hour support lines for emergencies. He dialed the number and waited through a series of automated prompts before finally reaching a live operator. The operator, a woman with a tired voice, asked for his unit serial number and the nature of the problem. Cormac explained the temperature fluctuations and the fact that manual adjustments were having no effect. The operator put him on hold for several minutes, then came back with a suggestion to reset the control system by cycling the power. Cormac thanked her and ended the call, then climbed out of the cab again to access the reefer unit. He located the main power switch and flipped it off, waiting 30 seconds before flipping it back on. The compressor restarted with a low hum, and the control panel lit up as the system ran through its initialization sequence. Cormac watched the temperature readout as it came online. -14.5 degrees. The reset had done nothing. If anything, the temperature had dropped further. Cormac felt a knot of frustration tighten in his chest. This was not a simple malfunction. Something was actively pulling the temperature down, and he had no idea what or why. He returned to the cab and continued driving, deciding that his best option was to push through to the next major town and find a repair shop that could diagnose the problem properly. The nearest town large enough to have a truck service center was about 60 miles ahead, a place called Laverne, just over the Kansas border. Cormac increased his speed slightly, keeping an eye on the temperature display as he drove. The reading continued to fluctuate, dropping to -15, then -16, then suddenly jumping back up to -12 before settling at -14 again. The pattern was erratic, almost rhythmic, like the system was fighting against itself. Around 1:30 a.m., Cormac passed mile marker 89. The road here was even more desolate than before, with no lights visible in any direction, and only the occasional fence post marking the boundary between the highway and the open land beyond. The temperature display showed -17 degrees now, far below the set point and well into the danger zone for most frozen products. Cormac knew that if the temperature stayed this low for too long, the vegetables in the trailer would become over-frozen, their cell structures rupturing and turning the product into mush when it thawed. The company would reject the load, and Cormac would be on the hook for the loss. He was considering pulling over again to call his dispatcher when he noticed something odd. There was a rest area ahead, marked by a small blue sign that indicated facilities and parking. Cormac did not remember seeing a rest area on this stretch of highway during previous runs, but it had been a while since he had driven this exact route. He slowed as he approached, debating whether to stop or push through to Laverne. The rest area was small and poorly lit, with just a few parking spaces and a single cinder block building that housed restrooms. There were no other vehicles in the lot, and the lights inside the building were off. Cormac almost drove past, but something made him pull in. Maybe it was the need to stretch his legs, or the hope that stopping might give the reefer unit a chance to stabilize. He parked near the entrance to the building and killed the engine, sitting in the silence for a moment. The temperature display on his phone showed -18 degrees now. Cormac shook his head and climbed out, zipping his jacket up against the cold night air. The rest area was quiet, the only sound coming from the distant hum of the reefer unit and the faint rustle of wind through the grass. He walked toward the building, intending to use the restroom and maybe splash some water on his face to wake himself up. As he approached the entrance, he noticed a piece of paper taped to the door. It was a maintenance notice printed on official-looking letterhead. The text was brief. Facilities temporarily closed for repairs. Expected reopening, TBD, M. Keene, Way Station Maintenance. Cormac frowned. The notice was dated 3 weeks ago, but the building looked like it had been closed for much longer. The windows were covered in dust, and the parking lot was littered with dead leaves and debris. He turned away from the building and walked back toward the truck, but something caught his eye. There was a small, rectangular object sitting on one of the picnic tables near the edge of the lot. Cormac walked over to investigate. It was a receipt printer, the kind used at gas stations and convenience stores, sitting in the middle of the table like someone had just set it down and walked away. The printer was still warm to the touch, and a fresh receipt was hanging from the slot. Cormac pulled the receipt free and held it up to the light from his phone. The print was clear but faded slightly, showing a transaction for diesel fuel and a date stamp. Today's date, 1:42 a.m., 17 minutes from now. Cormac stared at the receipt, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The timestamp was in the future, which was impossible unless the printer's clock was set wrong. But the receipt was warm, recently printed, and sitting on a table in an abandoned rest area where no one else was around. Cormac looked around the lot, searching for any sign of another person or vehicle. There was nothing, just his truck, the dark building, and the empty highway stretching away in both directions. He folded the receipt and put it in his pocket, then returned to the cab. The temperature display now read minus 19 degrees. Cormac started the engine and pulled out of the rest area, accelerating back onto the highway. His hands were shaking slightly, not from cold but from a growing sense of unease that he could not quite name. The road ahead was dark and straight, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the night. Cormac pushed the truck up to 65 miles per hour, eager to put distance between himself and the rest area. As he drove, he became aware of a sound coming from the trailer. It was faint at first, barely audible over the road noise and the hum of the engine. A soft scraping, like something being dragged across metal. Cormac turned down the radio and listened more carefully. The sound was rhythmic, repeating every few seconds. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. It seemed to be coming from the front section of the trailer, near the refrigeration unit. Cormac checked the mirrors, half expecting to see something on the road behind him. But there was nothing. Just the dark highway and the faint glow of his taillights reflecting off the asphalt. The temperature dropped again, minus 20 degrees, minus 21. The compressor was running at full capacity now, straining to keep up with whatever force was pulling the temperature down. Cormac knew that if it continued like this, the unit would burn out within an hour, leaving him with a trailer full of thawing vegetables and no way to keep them frozen. He needed to reach Laverne, find a repair shop, and get this sorted out before the damage became irreversible. But Laverne was still 40 miles away, and every mile felt longer than the last. Cormac passed another mile marker, the reflective numbers glowing briefly in his headlights before disappearing into the darkness behind him. He checked the display again, minus 22 degrees. The scraping sound from the trailer grew louder, more insistent, like something was trying to force its way through the walls. The scraping sound persisted for the next 15 miles, a steady rhythm that seemed to sync with the dropping temperature readings. Cormac kept his eyes on the road, but his attention was split between the highway ahead and the displays on his dashboard. Minus 23 degrees. Minus 24. The numbers kept climbing downward in defiance of every principle of thermodynamics he understood. Reefer units were designed to maintain cold, not to superheat in reverse. Even a catastrophic failure would result in warming, not this relentless freeze that seemed to be pulling heat out of the trailer faster than physics should allow. Cormac tried the manufacturer's support line again, but this time the call would not connect. The phone showed full signal strength, but each attempt to dial resulted in a single ring, followed by silence. He tried his dispatcher's number, then the main office line, then even his brother's cell phone just to test if the issue was specific to certain numbers. Every call failed the same way. One ring, then nothing. Cormac set the phone down and gripped the wheel tighter, his jaw clenched. Whatever was happening, he was dealing with it alone. The highway rose gradually as it approached the Kansas border, climbing into low, rolling hills that were invisible in the darkness, but noticeable in the way the engine labored slightly under the load. Cormac downshifted and maintained his speed, watching the temperature display out of the corner of his eye. Minus 25 degrees now. The scraping had stopped, replaced by a new sound, a soft creaking like the metal walls of the trailer were contracting in the cold. Cormac had hauled frozen loads through Minnesota winters and Montana blizzards, and he had never heard a trailer make sounds like this. It was not the normal expansion and contraction of metal responding to temperature change. This sounded organic somehow, deliberate, like the trailer itself was shifting and settling under some invisible weight. Just past mile marker 112, Cormac saw lights ahead. Not the scattered glow of a town, but a single, concentrated point of illumination off to the right side of the highway. As he drew closer, he could make out the shape of a building, a small roadside structure with a gravel parking area and a hand-painted sign that read, J. Penn, Roadside Service, 24 hours. The building was little more than a shack, with wooden siding that had been weathered gray and a corrugated metal roof that sagged in the middle. A single fluorescent light buzzed above the entrance, and a rusted pickup truck sat parked near the side of the building. Cormac had not seen this place on previous runs along US 83, but then again, he rarely drove this route at night. He slowed and pulled into the gravel lot, the trailer crunching over the loose stones as he brought the rig to a stop. The building's windows were lit from inside, showing shelves stocked with what looked like basic supplies, motor oil, coolant, snacks. Cormac killed the engine and sat for a moment, debating whether to go inside. The place had the feel of something that should not exist. A roadside service station in the middle of nowhere with no visible business and no reason to be open at 2 in the morning. But his options were limited, and if there was even a chance someone inside could help diagnose the reefer problem, it was worth the risk. He climbed out of the cab and walked toward the entrance, his boots crunching on the gravel. The door was propped open with a cinder block, and warm air spilled out into the cold night. Cormac stepped inside and looked around. The interior was cramped and cluttered, with narrow aisles between shelves that held an odd assortment of items. There were the usual automotive supplies, but also things that seemed out of place. Hand tools that looked decades old, glass bottles filled with amber liquid, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. A small counter sat at the back of the room, and behind it stood a man who appeared to be in his 70s with white hair and a weathered face that suggested a lifetime spent outdoors. The man looked up as Cormac entered, his expression neutral. "Help you?" he asked, his voice rough and unhurried. Cormac approached the counter and explained his situation. The temperature fluctuations, the failed diagnostics, the strange sounds from the trailer. The man listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on Cormac with an intensity that was unsettling. When Cormac finished, the man nodded slowly. "Reefer acting up," he said, more statement than question. "Been seeing that a lot lately. This stretch of road has a way of doing things to equipment. Temperature drops, systems go haywire. Usually sorts itself out by morning." Cormac frowned. "Usually? What do you mean usually?" The man shrugged and reached under the counter, pulling out a handwritten ledger. He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing down columns of dates and notes. Had 3 other drivers stop in the past month with the same issue, all of them hauling cold loads, all of them having problems right around mile marker 89. He looked up at Cormac. "You passed that marker?" Cormac nodded. The man grunted and closed the ledger. "Thought so. Something about that spot. Air gets cold there, colder than it should. Plays hell with the sensors." Cormac wanted to ask more, but before he could speak, the man reached into a drawer and pulled out a receipt, handing it across the counter. "Here, you will need this for your records." Cormac took the receipt and glanced at it. It was printed on the same kind of thermal paper as the one he had found at the rest area, and it showed a fuel transaction dated today with a timestamp of 2:17 a.m. Cormac checked his watch. It was 2:09 a.m. The receipt was dated 8 minutes in the future. He looked up at the man, his pulse quickening. "This timestamp is wrong," he said, keeping his voice steady. The man glanced at the receipt and shrugged. "Printer clock runs fast sometimes. Don't worry about it." Cormac set the receipt on the counter and stepped back. "I did not buy any fuel." The man's expression did not change. "No, but you will. About 3 miles up the road there is a station. You will stop there because your fuel gauge will drop suddenly and you will think you are running out. When you stop, you will fill up, and the receipt will match this one." He tapped the paper with one finger. "Happens every time. Road makes things happen before they happen. Best just to go with it." Cormac felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He backed toward the door, keeping his eyes on the man. "Thanks for the information," he said, his voice tight. The man nodded. "Safe travels, and do not open the trailer doors until you get where you are going. Whatever is making that cold, it does not like being looked at." Cormac did not respond. He turned and walked quickly back to the truck, his heart pounding. He climbed into the cab and locked the doors, then sat gripping the wheel and trying to steady his breathing. The temperature display read -27 degrees. He started the engine and pulled out of the gravel lot, accelerating back onto the highway. The roadside service station disappeared in his mirrors, the single fluorescent light fading into the darkness. Cormac checked his fuel gauge. It showed just over half a tank, plenty to reach Laverne. He watched the needle carefully as he drove, waiting to see if it would drop the way the man had predicted. For the first 2 miles it stayed steady. Then, just past the 3-mile mark, the needle began to fall. Slowly at first, then faster, dropping from half to a quarter, then to an eighth, then hovering just above empty. Cormac cursed and looked ahead for a gas station. The highway was dark and empty, no signs of civilization in any direction. He was about to pull over and check the fuel tank for a leak when he saw lights ahead. A gas station exactly where the man had said it would be. Cormac pulled in, his mind reeling. The station was small and automated, with no attendant and no building, just 4 pumps under a metal canopy. He parked at the nearest pump and climbed out, walking around to the fuel tank. The cap was secure, no signs of leakage. He unscrewed it and inserted the nozzle, starting the pump. As the fuel flowed, Cormac pulled out the receipt the man had given him and compared it to the display on the pump. The amount was climbing toward the exact figure printed on the receipt, gallon for gallon. When the pump clicked off, the total matched perfectly. 42.3 gallons at $3.18 per gallon, totaling $134.51, the same numbers on the receipt. Cormac stared at the pump display, then at the paper in his hand. He had not bought fuel yet when the receipt was printed, but now the transaction had occurred exactly as predicted. Time was not flowing correctly here, or information was moving backward through it, creating receipts for events that had not happened yet but somehow would. Cormac replaced the nozzle and screwed the fuel cap back on, his hands shaking. He climbed back into the cab and sat in the darkness trying to process what was happening. The temperature display showed -28 degrees. The trailer creaked behind him, the metal groaning under stress. Cormac pulled up the manifest on his phone and scrolled through the cargo list. 26 pallets of frozen vegetables, each one itemized by weight and product code. He had verified the count himself back in Amarillo, watching as the warehouse crew loaded each pallet and secured it with straps. 26 pallets. No more, no less. But now, as he looked at the digital copy of the manifest, something was different. The list showed 27 pallets. Cormac scrolled back to the top and counted again. 27. There was an extra entry at the bottom of the list, a pallet marked only as supplemental, do not inventory. No weight, no product code, just that single line of text. Cormac stared at the screen, his stomach tightening. He knew what he had loaded. He had counted every pallet, checked every strap. There had been 26. He was certain. He opened the email attachment that contained the original manifest, the one sent to him before pickup. It showed 26 pallets. He compared it to the current version on the logistics platform. 27. Somewhere between Amarillo and this gas station, an extra pallet had been added to the manifest without his knowledge or consent. Either that, or the manifest was changing retroactively, rewriting itself to reflect something that had always been there, but that Cormac had somehow failed to notice. Cormac exited the manifest and opened the photo gallery on his phone. He had taken pictures of the loaded trailer back in Amarillo, a standard practice to document the condition of the cargo before transport. He scrolled through the images, zooming in on each one. The pallets were clearly visible, stacked in neat rows inside the trailer. Cormac counted them in the photos. 26, no 27th pallet, but according to the manifest there should have been one, tucked in the front corner near the refrigeration unit where it would be hardest to see. Cormac set the phone down and stared through the windshield at the dark highway. He needed to check the trailer, to open the doors and verify whether there was an extra pallet inside. But the man at the roadside service station had warned him not to open the doors, had said that whatever was making the cold did not like being looked at. Cormac did not know if he believed that, but he also could not ignore the growing sense that opening those doors would be a mistake, that some things were better left unseen until they reached their destination. He started the engine and pulled out of the gas station, merging back onto US 83. The temperature display read minus 29 degrees. Cormac drove in silence, his mind cycling through possibilities and explanations, none of which made sense. The road ahead was empty and straight, cutting through flat prairie land that stretched to the horizon. No other vehicles, no lights, just the highway and the darkness and the sound of the reefer unit laboring to keep up with the impossible cold. Around 3 a.m., Cormac passed a mile marker and noticed something odd. The number on the marker was 89, the same number the man at the service station had mentioned. But Cormac had already passed mile marker 89 more than an hour ago, back when the temperature first started dropping. He slowed and checked his GPS. According to the system, he was at mile marker 126, nearly 40 miles north of where he had been. But the physical marker on the side of the road clearly read 89. Cormac stopped the truck and sat in the middle of the empty highway, staring at the marker through the passenger window. He put the truck in reverse and backed up slowly until the marker was directly beside the cab. The number was unmistakable: 89. Cormac shifted back into drive and rolled forward, watching the marker recede in the side mirror. After a quarter mile, another marker appeared. This one read 90. Cormac continued driving, counting the markers as they passed. 91, 92, 93. The sequence was normal now, progressing in order. But he had somehow passed 89 twice, or returned to it without realizing, or the road had looped back on itself in a way that his GPS did not register. The temperature display dropped to minus 30 degrees. The creaking from the trailer grew louder, accompanied now by a faint whistling sound, like wind blowing through a narrow gap. Cormac checked the mirrors and saw frost forming on the rear doors of the trailer, thick white crystals spreading across the metal in intricate patterns. The frost should not have been visible from this distance, but it glowed faintly in the darkness, as if lit from within. Cormac accelerated, pushing the truck up to 70 miles per hour. He needed to get off this highway to reach a town with people and lights and some semblance of normalcy. But the road refused to cooperate. Every sign he passed indicated that Laverne was still 30 miles ahead, the same distance it had been for the past hour. The mile markers continued their sequence, 94, 95, 96, but the town never got closer. Cormac felt a rising panic that he forced down through sheer willpower. He was a professional driver, he told himself. He had been on the road for 9 years, had handled breakdowns and bad weather and difficult customers. This was just another problem to solve, another obstacle to navigate. He would reach Laverne eventually, and when he did, he would get the reefer unit checked and the manifest sorted out, and everything would make sense. The temperature dropped to minus 31 degrees. The whistling sound grew sharper, more insistent. And somewhere in the trailer, hidden among the 26 pallets he had loaded and the one extra pallet that may or may not exist, something was pulling heat out of the air faster than any machine could generate it. Cormac drove through the darkness with the temperature display hovering at minus 31 degrees, watching the mile markers pass in their steady progression, while Laverne remained perpetually 30 miles away. The highway had taken on a dreamlike quality, repetitive and unchanging, as if he were driving on a treadmill that moved the scenery past him without actually transporting him anywhere. He checked his odometer against the mile markers and confirmed that the numbers matched. He was covering distance. The truck was moving forward, but somehow the destination never got closer. It was like being trapped in a loop, making progress that went nowhere. Around 3:45 a.m., the whistling sound from the trailer changed pitch, becoming higher and more sustained. Cormac glanced at the side mirror and saw that the frost on the rear doors had spread, covering the entire surface in thick white patterns. The patterns were not random. They formed geometric shapes, interlocking hexagons and spirals that repeated across the metal like a deliberately designed mosaic. Cormac had seen frost patterns before, the delicate fractals that formed on windows during cold nights, but this was different. These patterns were too regular, too precise, as if something had traced them onto the metal with careful intention. He slowed the truck and pulled onto the shoulder, leaving the engine running while he climbed out to inspect the trailer more closely. The night air was cold, but not freezing. Maybe 35 degrees, nowhere near cold enough to cause the kind of frost he was seeing. Cormac approached the rear of the trailer and reached out to touch one of the patterns. The metal was so cold it burned his fingertips, and he jerked his hand back. The frost was not just on the surface. It seemed to extend into the metal itself, penetrating deep enough that the entire door panel radiated cold like a block of ice. Cormac walked along the side of the trailer, examining the panels. The frost was concentrated near the rear doors but extended forward in streaks and swirls, following the seams where the panels joined. As he reached the front of the trailer near the reefer unit, he noticed something that made him stop. There were marks in the frost, shallow indentations that looked almost like footprints. They were small, maybe the size of a child's shoe, and they ran in a line from the bottom of the trailer up the side panel, as if something had walked vertically up the wall. Cormac stared at the marks, his breath visible in the cold air. He counted 12 of them, evenly spaced, leading up to the roof of the trailer where they disappeared. He stepped back and looked at the roof, but from ground level he could not see if the footprints continued. The rational part of his mind told him it was condensation, or runoff from the reefer unit. Moisture that had frozen in a pattern that coincidentally resembled footprints. But the irrational part, the part that had been growing louder since he picked up the receipt with the future timestamp, knew better. Something had been on the outside of the trailer, something that could walk on vertical surfaces and leave marks in frost that should not exist in 35-degree weather. Cormac returned to the cab and pulled out his phone, opening the camera app. He took several photos of the frost patterns and the footprints, making sure to capture them from multiple angles. If this job went south and he needed to file a claim or explain what happened, he wanted documentation. He reviewed the photos on the screen, zooming in on the footprints. In the digital image, they looked even more deliberate, each one showing a distinct heel and toe impression. Cormac saved the photos and put the phone away, then climbed back into the cab and locked the doors. The temperature display now read minus 32 degrees. Cormac checked the reefer unit diagnostics and saw that the compressor had stopped cycling. It was running continuously at maximum output, and yet the temperature continued to drop. That should have been impossible. A compressor running at full capacity should eventually reach an equilibrium, balancing the cold generation against the heat leaking in from outside. But this system was behaving as if there were no external heat to counteract, as if the trailer existed in a vacuum where temperature could fall indefinitely without resistance. Cormac pulled back onto the highway and continued north, determined to break free of whatever loop or anomaly was holding him in place. He pushed the truck up to 75 miles per hour, faster than he would normally drive with a loaded trailer, but he needed to see if speed would make a difference. The mile markers continued their sequence: 101, 102, 103, each one appearing in the headlights at the expected intervals. But the sign for Laverne never appeared, and the distance counter on his GPS remained stubbornly fixed at 28 miles. After another 15 minutes of driving, Cormac saw something new on the side of the road. It was a rest area, similar to the one he had stopped at earlier, but slightly larger. The sign indicated parking for trucks and RVs, and there were lights visible in the distance. Cormac almost drove past, but a desperate need for contact with another human being made him pull off. If there were other drivers at this rest area, he could ask them if they had experienced similar problems. Maybe this was a known issue on this stretch of highway, something that local drivers were familiar with, but that he, as an outsider, had never encountered. The rest area parking lot was empty except for a single sedan parked near the entrance to the restroom building. Cormac pulled the rig into a truck parking space and killed the engine. The temperature display read -33 degrees. He climbed out and walked toward the building, his footsteps crunching on the frost-covered pavement. The air felt warmer here, or maybe he was just adjusting to the cold. The building was a standard brick structure with restrooms on one side and vending machines on the other. The lights were on inside, and Cormac could see through the windows that the interior was empty. He pushed through the door and entered the building, grateful for the warmth. The vending machines hummed softly, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Cormac walked to the restroom and splashed cold water on his face, trying to wake himself up and clear his head. He looked at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he had not slept in days, even though it had only been one night. The stress of the situation was wearing on him, eroding his composure mile by mile. When he stepped back outside, he noticed something odd about the sedan parked near the entrance. It was the same make and model as the one he had seen at the previous rest area, a dark blue Honda with tinted windows and a dent in the rear bumper. Cormac walked over to it and peered through the driver's side window. The interior was empty. No personal items, no trash, nothing to indicate who owned it or why it was parked here. But the hood was warm when he touched it, still radiating heat from a recently running engine. Someone had been here within the past few minutes, but there was no one in sight. Cormac looked around the parking lot, scanning the shadows beyond the reach of the lights. The rest area was surrounded by open prairie, with no buildings or roads visible in any direction. If someone had gotten out of the sedan and walked away, there was nowhere for them to go. Unless they had walked into the darkness, which seemed unlikely, they should still be here. Cormac called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Hello? Anyone here?" No response. Just the hum of the vending machines and the faint whistle of wind through the grass. He returned to his truck and climbed into the cab, locking the doors behind him. The sedan bothered him more than it should have. It was the second identical vehicle he had seen at two different rest areas, parked in almost the same position, with the same warm hood suggesting recent use. Either someone was following him, stopping at each rest area moments before he arrived and then disappearing, or the same sedan was somehow appearing in multiple locations. Neither explanation made sense, but he could not think of a third option that fit the facts. The temperature display read -34 degrees. Cormac started the engine and pulled out of the rest area, accelerating back onto the highway. He had been driving for over 6 hours now, and the sun should have been rising soon. But when he checked the time on his phone, it was only 4:17 a.m. Less than 30 minutes had passed since he left the gas station, even though it felt like hours. Time was distorting, either moving slower than it should or looping back on itself in ways that made his phone clock unreliable. Cormac decided to try a different approach. Instead of continuing north toward Laverne, he would take the next exit and head east, leaving US 83 entirely. If the road itself was the problem, if there was something about this particular highway that was causing the anomalies, then getting off it might break the pattern. He watched for exit signs, but none appeared. The highway continued straight and unchanging, with no turnoffs or intersections. According to his memory of the route, there should have been at least 2 exits in the past 20 miles, small county roads that branched off to farming communities. But the road offered no escape, just the endless forward motion through darkness. The whistling from the trailer grew louder, joined now by a cracking sound, sharp and irregular like ice breaking under pressure. Cormac checked the mirrors and saw that the frost on the rear doors had thickened, forming a layer several inches deep. The patterns were more elaborate now, no longer just geometric shapes, but something that resembled writing. Cormac could not read the symbols, if that is what they were, but they had the structure of language. Characters arranged in lines that ran horizontally across the doors. He pulled over again and got out, walking back to examine the writing more closely. Up close, the symbols were even more distinct, each one carefully formed and clearly deliberate. Some of them looked like letters from alphabets Cormac vaguely recognized, Cyrillic or Greek, but distorted and combined in ways that did not correspond to any language he knew. Other symbols were entirely unfamiliar, abstract marks that could have been numbers or pictograms. Cormac took more photos, capturing the writing from multiple angles. He did not know what it meant, but it was evidence of something, proof that this was not just equipment failure or his imagination. As he stepped back to get a wider shot, his boot crunched on something that was not gravel. Cormac looked down and saw a thin layer of ice covering the pavement around the trailer. The ice extended in a rough circle about 10 feet in diameter, centered on the rear doors. It was not black ice, slick and invisible, but thick white ice that reflected the trailer lights. Cormac crouched down and touched it with his fingers. It was hard and cold, and when he scraped at it with his boot, it did not crack or chip. It felt more like glass than frozen water. He stood up and walked around the perimeter of the ice circle, trying to understand what he was seeing. The ice ended abruptly at the 10-foot mark, with no gradual thinning or melting. It was as if someone had drawn a precise boundary and frozen everything inside it. Beyond the circle, the pavement was dry and clear. Cormac looked at the trailer, then at the ice, then back at the trailer. Something inside was radiating cold with enough intensity to freeze the ground beneath it, cold that penetrated through the insulated floor and metal frame and turned moisture in the air into solid ice. Cormac returned to the cab and pulled up the manifest again, focusing on the entry for the extra pallet. Supplemental, do not inventory. He tapped on the entry, hoping for more details, but it expanded to show only the same text. No weight, no dimensions, no product code. It was as if the pallet existed purely as a placeholder, a marker in the system that indicated something was there without defining what that something was. Cormac thought about the man at the roadside service station, Jubal Penn, who had warned him not to open the trailer doors. Whatever was making the cold, he had said, it did not like being looked at. Cormac made a decision. He would not open the doors. He would not inspect the cargo or try to verify whether the 27th pallet existed. He would drive straight through to Omaha, deliver the load as instructed, and let someone else deal with whatever was in that trailer. It was not cowardice, he told himself. It was pragmatism. He was a driver, not an investigator, and his job was to transport cargo from point A to point B, not to interrogate the contents or question the paperwork. If something illegal or dangerous was being moved under the guise of frozen vegetables, that was a problem for law enforcement, not for him. He started the engine and merged back onto the highway, his resolve firm. The temperature display read -35 degrees. The cracking sounds from the trailer grew more frequent, a steady percussion that kept time with the miles. Cormac turned up the radio, trying to drown out the noise, but the only station he could find was playing a loop of old country songs, the same 3 tracks repeating over and over. After the 5th repetition, he turned the radio off and drove in silence. Just past mile marker 118, the highway began to descend into a shallow valley. Cormac could see lights in the distance now, a cluster of them that suggested a town. His heart lifted slightly. If this was Laverne, if he had finally broken free of the loop, then he could stop and get help, call a mechanic, report the problems with the reefer unit. He accelerated down the slope, watching the lights grow closer. But as he reached the bottom of the valley and the town came into view, his hope faded. The lights were not from Laverne. They were from the same rest area he had stopped at twice before. The one with the warm receipt printer and the closed maintenance notice signed by M. Keene. Cormac slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a stop in the middle of the highway. He stared at the rest area, his hands shaking on the wheel. He had been driving north for hours, covering over 100 miles according to the odometer, and yet he had somehow circled back to the same location. The highway was not a loop. There were no turns or exits that would allow for such a thing. But here he was, back at the starting point, with the temperature at -36 degrees, and the trailer covered in frost patterns that looked like writing in a language he could not read. He sat in the darkness, the engine idling, trying to decide what to do. He could not keep driving north if it only brought him back to where he started. But he also could not turn around and go south, because that would take him away from the delivery destination and leave him stranded with a failing reefer unit and a load of thawing vegetables. He was trapped, caught in a situation that defied logic and offered no clear solution. And somewhere in the trailer behind him, nestled among 26 pallets of frozen corn and green beans, was a 27th pallet that should not exist, pulling heat out of the air and rewriting the laws of physics 1 degree at a time. Cormac sat in the idling truck, staring at the rest area that should not have been there, and made a choice that felt less like courage and more like surrender. He would not try to understand what was happening. He would not attempt to force logic onto a situation that had abandoned all pretense of following natural law. Instead, he would simply wait for dawn, wait for the loop to break, wait for whatever force was manipulating the highway to finish with him and let him pass. He turned off the engine to conserve fuel and sat in the darkness with the temperature display glowing at -36 degrees. The first hour passed in silence. Cormac watched the dashboard clock, verifying that time was at least moving forward in the cab even if the world outside seemed frozen in repetition. The cracking sounds from the trailer continued at irregular intervals, sometimes quiet enough to ignore, sometimes loud enough to make him flinch. He tried not to think about the ice circle forming beneath the trailer, or the footprints walking up the side panels, or the writing in the frost that resembled language. Those details led to questions he had no framework to answer, so he pushed them aside and focused on the simple act of waiting. Around 5:30 a.m. by his phone clock, something changed. The darkness outside began to thin, not with the gradual approach of dawn, but suddenly, as if someone had turned up a dimmer switch. Cormac sat up straighter and looked through the windshield. The sky to the east was lightening, streaks of gray and pale blue pushing back the blackness. The rest area looked different in the growing light, less sinister and more mundane. Just a small roadside facility with weathered concrete and faded paint. The sedan that had been parked near the entrance was gone. Cormac had not heard it start or drive away. but it was no longer there. He started the engine and checked the temperature display, minus 34 degrees. The temperature had risen 2 degrees, a small change but the first upward movement he had seen all night. Cormac felt a cautious flicker of hope. Maybe the anomaly was tied to darkness, to the hours between midnight and dawn when the highway was at its most deserted. Maybe sunrise would break whatever hold this stretch of road had on him. He pulled out of the rest area and back onto US 83, heading north once again. The mile markers resumed their sequence where he had left off, starting at 109 and climbing steadily. Cormac watched them carefully, counting each one and comparing it to his odometer. The numbers matched. He was making forward progress. After 10 miles, he passed a green highway sign that read, Laverne, 18 miles. Cormac exhaled slowly, his grip on the wheel loosening slightly. The town was finally getting closer. The loop had broken. He drove through the early morning light with the temperature slowly climbing, minus 33, minus 32, minus 31. The reefer unit was still running at full capacity, but the rate of temperature drop had reversed. Heat was returning to the system, either because the external conditions were normalizing or because whatever had been pulling the heat out was weakening with the sunrise. Cormac did not care which explanation was correct. All that mattered was that the crisis was easing and his cargo might still be salvageable. Laverne appeared on the horizon just after 6 o'clock a.m., a small town with grain elevators and a water tower visible against the pale sky. Cormac took the first exit and followed the signs to a truck service center on the east side of town. The facility was already open, with mechanics moving around the shop and 2 other trucks parked in the service bays. Cormac pulled into an empty bay and killed the engine, then climbed out and walked to the office. A woman in coveralls looked up from a computer as he entered, her expression friendly and professional. "Help you?" she asked. Cormac explained the temperature problems, keeping his description focused on the mechanical symptoms and avoiding any mention of the stranger aspects of the night. The woman took notes and asked a few clarifying questions, then told him a technician would take a look within the hour. Cormac thanked her and returned to the truck, too wired to sleep but too exhausted to do much else. He sat in the cab and scrolled through his phone, checking emails and messages he had missed during the night. There was nothing urgent, just routine dispatch updates and automated alerts. The technician arrived 40 minutes later, a young man named Travis who approached the truck with a tablet and a toolbox. He climbed up onto the trailer and opened the access panel for the reefer unit, running diagnostics while Cormac stood nearby and watched. After about 15 minutes, Travis climbed back down and shook his head. "System looks fine," he said. "No faults, no sensor errors. Temperature is reading minus 28 right now, which is colder than your set point, but it is stabilizing. Probably just had a thermostat glitch that resolved itself." Cormac frowned. "It dropped to minus 36 last night. I have the logs to prove it." Travis pulled up the unit's internal data log on his tablet and scrolled through the entries. "Lowest recorded temperature here is minus 29.2 at 4:47 a.m., nothing below that." He showed Cormac the screen. The graph displayed temperature fluctuations throughout the night, but the values never dipped below minus 29. Cormac stared at the data, his mind struggling to reconcile it with what he had seen on his own display. He had watched the numbers fall to minus 36. He had screenshots on his phone to prove it. He pulled out his phone and opened the photo gallery, scrolling to the images he had taken of the dashboard display. The photos were there, time-stamped and clear. But when he zoomed in on the temperature reading in each image, the numbers were different. Where he remembered seeing minus 36, the display in the photo showed minus 29. The data had changed retroactively, rewriting itself in both his phone's memory and the reefer unit's logs. Cormac lowered the phone and looked at Travis, who was watching him with a neutral expression. "You okay?" Travis asked. Cormac nodded slowly. "Yeah, just tired, long night." Travis clipped the tablet to his belt and gestured toward the rear of the trailer. "You want me to check the cargo, make sure nothing thawed or got damaged?" Cormac hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I will verify it at delivery. Thanks for checking the unit." Travis shrugged and walked back toward the shop, leaving Cormac alone with the truck. Cormac walked to the rear of the trailer and examined the doors. The frost was gone. The metal was cool to the touch but not freezing, and there were no patterns, no writing, no footprints. The ice circle that had formed on the pavement was also gone, leaving only clean asphalt beneath the trailer. It was as if the entire night had been erased, scrubbed from physical reality and left only in Cormac's memory. He pulled out his phone again and checked the photos he had taken of the frost patterns. The images were still there, but they had changed. Instead of intricate symbols and geometric writing, the frost in the photos now looked random and natural, just ordinary ice crystals forming irregular shapes. Cormac sat on the edge of the trailer platform and put his head in his hands. He was losing his grip, either on reality or on sanity, and he was not sure which possibility frightened him more. Everything he had experienced during the night, the temperature drops, the time loops, the receipts from the future, had been real to him in the moment. But now the evidence was gone or altered, leaving him with nothing but his own unreliable recollection. He could report what happened to his company, but without corroborating data they would assume equipment failure or driver fatigue. He could go to the police, but what would he tell them? That he had driven in circles for 6 hours and somehow ended up exactly where he needed to be? He climbed back into the cab and pulled up the manifest one last time. The entry for the 27th pallet was gone. The list now showed 26 pallets, the same count he had verified in Amarillo. Cormac closed the app and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. Whatever had been in the trailer, whatever had pulled the temperature down and frozen the ground beneath him, it had covered its tracks. Or perhaps it had never been there at all, just a glitch in the system, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the isolation of night driving. Cormac started the engine and pulled out of the service center heading east toward Omaha. The sun was fully up now, the sky a clear pale blue with scattered clouds. The reefer unit hummed steadily, maintaining a stable -10 degrees. The road ahead was straight and normal, with traffic picking up as the morning progressed. Cormac drove mechanically, his mind elsewhere, replaying the events of the night and searching for some explanation that made sense. He found none. He reached the distribution center in Omaha just before noon, backing the trailer up to the loading dock and presenting his paperwork to the warehouse supervisor. The supervisor verified the seal, checked the manifest, and authorized the offload. Cormac stood aside as the warehouse crew unloaded the pallets, watching them work with a detached curiosity. He counted each pallet as it came out. 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 26. No extra pallet. No supplemental item that was not supposed to be inventoried. Just frozen vegetables. Exactly as ordered. When the trailer was empty, Cormac walked inside and did a final inspection. The interior was clean and undamaged, with no scratches on the walls and no signs that anything unusual had occurred. The floor showed no footprints, no ice, no evidence of the extreme cold that had penetrated through the insulation. Cormac ran his hand along the wall where he had seen the claw marks in the frost. The metal was smooth and intact. He closed the doors and signed the delivery receipt, then climbed back into the cab and drove to a nearby truck stop. He parked in a far corner of the lot and sat in the cab staring at nothing. His phone rang, the dispatcher calling to confirm delivery and assign him the next load. Cormac let it go to voicemail. He was not ready to take another job, not ready to get back on the road and pretend that everything was normal. He needed time to process, to figure out whether what he had experienced was real or imagined. But time would not give him answers. The night had happened, and then it had unhappened, leaving him stranded between two versions of reality with no way to prove which one was true. That evening, Cormac checked into a motel near the truck stop and tried to sleep. He lay in the dark room with the television on low volume, drifting in and out of shallow rest. Around midnight, he gave up and turned on the light, pulling out his phone to review the photos one more time. The images of the frost patterns and the dashboard temperature readings were still there, but they continued to show the altered versions, the random frost and the lower numbers. Cormac scrolled to the photo of the receipt from J. Penn's roadside service station, the one with the future timestamp. The image was blank now, just a white screen with no text or numbers visible. Cormac deleted the photos and put the phone away. There was no point in keeping them. They were not evidence of anything except his own confusion. He turned off the light and lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of trucks coming and going in the parking lot outside. He thought about the man at the roadside station, Jubal Penn, who had warned him not to open the trailer. Penn had known what would happen, had known about the temperature drops and the time loops and the receipts that printed before the transactions occurred. Which meant this had happened to other drivers, maybe many of them, and they had all chosen to stay silent about it because talking made you sound crazy. Cormac decided he would do the same. He would accept the next load assignment, drive his route, and never speak about the night on US 83. If other drivers asked about the highway, he would say it was fine, just a long stretch of nothing between Amarillo and Omaha. He would not mention the rest areas or the mile markers that repeated, or the sedan that appeared in multiple locations. And he would never, under any circumstances, haul a refrigerated load along that route again. 3 days later, Cormac was back on the road, heading west with a load of electronics bound for Phoenix. The dispatcher had offered him a northbound run along US 83, but he had declined without explanation. The dispatcher had not pressed for details, just assigned him a different route. Cormac was grateful. He drove through Kansas and into Colorado, then down through New Mexico, keeping to the interstates and avoiding the smaller highways. Everything was normal. The loads stayed secure, the equipment functioned properly, and the mile markers progressed in order without looping or skipping. But at night, when he stopped at rest areas to sleep, Cormac found himself checking the parking lots for a dark blue sedan with a dent in the rear bumper. He never saw it, but the absence did not bring relief. He knew it was out there somewhere, parked at a rest area on a lonely highway, waiting for the next driver to pull in and discover a warm hood and an empty interior. And somewhere on US 83, between mile markers 89 and 119, the temperature was dropping in the back of a trailer that should not exist, pulling heat out of the air and leaving frost patterns that looked like writing in a language no one could read. Cormac kept the receipt from the gas station, the one that had predicted his fuel purchase 8 minutes before it happened. He had folded it carefully and placed it in his wallet, a small piece of paper that proved nothing but meant everything. Sometimes, when he stopped for fuel at normal stations on normal highways, he would pull out the receipt and look at it. The numbers were still there, unchanged. 42.3 gallons at $3.18 per gallon, $134.51. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m., 8 minutes in the future. But the date on the receipt was wrong now. Instead of showing the night he had driven US 83, it displayed a date 2 months in the future. Cormac did not know what that meant, whether the receipt was predicting another event or whether time was continuing to shift and rewrite itself around the paper. He kept it anyway, tucked between his CDL and a $20 bill, A reminder that some roads led to places that were not on any map, and some deliveries were made to destinations that existed in the spaces between what was real and what was possible. He never forgot the feeling of driving through the darkness while the temperature fell, and the mile markers looped, and the highway refused to let him reach his destination. And he never stopped wondering about the 27th pallet, the one that had appeared in the manifest and then disappeared, leaving no trace except a memory that might have been imagination. Somewhere in a warehouse, or a distribution center, or a loading dock, that pallet was waiting. And when the time came, when the temperature dropped, and the frost began to form and the footprints appeared walking up the side of a trailer, another driver would find it and wonder, just as Cormac had, whether they were losing their mind or whether the world was stranger and colder than anyone wanted to admit. The highway stretched on, and Cormac drove, and the miles added up. But he never took US 83 north again. Some roads, he had learned, were better left to others. Bram Hollis had been driving freight for 14 years, long enough to develop an instinct for when a route was about to go sideways. It was not anything he could articulate, just a feeling that settled in his gut when too many small things started going wrong in sequence. A delayed departure, a last-minute cargo change, a dispatcher who spoke too quickly and avoided direct questions. On this particular Wednesday evening in late October, Bram felt that instinct stirring as he pulled out of a warehouse complex in Memphis with a load of industrial plumbing supplies bound for a construction site in Little Rock. The delay had started at the loading dock, where the warehouse crew had taken an extra 2 hours to locate the correct pallets and verify the inventory. By the time Bram signed the paperwork and secured the load, it was almost 8 p.m., 3 hours behind schedule. The dispatcher had called twice during the wait, asking increasingly pointed questions about his estimated arrival time and whether he could make up the lost hours on the road. Bram had given non-committal answers, knowing that pushing too hard on unfamiliar roads at night was a good way to end up in a ditch, or worse. But the pressure was there, an unspoken expectation that he would deliver on time regardless of circumstances. He merged onto I-40 westbound as the last of the daylight faded from the sky, the highway stretching ahead in a straight line toward Arkansas. Traffic was moderate, a mix of commuters heading home and other commercial vehicles making their evening runs. Bram settled into the right lane and let the miles roll by, watching the reflective markers on the roadside flash past in steady rhythm. The load was secure, the truck was running smooth, and the weather forecast showed clear skies all the way to Little Rock. Everything should have been routine. The first sign of trouble came about 40 miles west of Memphis, just past the town of Brinkley. Bram's GPS, a commercial-grade unit he had been using for 5 years without issue, suddenly recalculated the route. The screen flickered, then displayed a new path that diverged from I-40 and headed south on a series of smaller highways. Bram frowned and tapped the screen, trying to revert to the original route. The GPS recalculated again, insisting on the southern detour. The estimated arrival time remained the same, which did not make sense given that the detour added at least 30 miles to the trip. Bram pulled over at the next rest area and checked the GPS settings. Everything looked normal. The destination was correct. The routing preferences were set to avoid tolls and prioritize highways. But when he started the route planning again, the GPS gave him the same detour, a path that took him off I-40 and onto Highway 17 south. Bram considered ignoring the GPS and following the interstate as planned, but years of experience had taught him that GPS errors usually indicated road closures or construction that had not been updated in his system. If I-40 was blocked ahead, the detour might be his only option. He pulled out his phone and checked the state transportation website for road conditions. The page loaded slowly, the mobile signal weak this far from major population centers. When it finally displayed, There were no reported closures on I-40 between his current location and Little Rock. Bram sat in the idling truck, weighing his options. He could continue on the interstate and hope the GPS was malfunctioning, or he could follow the detour and accept the extra miles. The dispatcher's voice echoed in his memory, urgent and insistent about making up time. Taking a detour that added distance seemed counterproductive. Bram decided to compromise. He would follow the interstate for another 20 miles and see if the GPS corrected itself. If not, he would take the next exit and find a truck stop where he could get local information about road conditions. He merged back onto I-40 and continued west, watching the GPS screen as it repeatedly tried to redirect him south. The device had never acted like this before, never insisted on a route with such persistence. After 15 miles, the GPS screen went dark, then rebooted itself. When it came back online, it showed the same southern detour, now marked as the only available route. The interstate ahead was displayed in gray, indicating a closed or impassable road. Bram cursed under his breath and took the next exit, following the ramp down to Highway 17. The transition from interstate to state highway was immediate and stark. I-40 had been wide and well lit, with clear lane markings and regular signage. Highway 17 was narrow and dark, a two-lane road that cut through dense forest with no shoulder and no reflective markers. Bram slowed to 50 miles per hour, his headlights the only source of illumination for miles. The trees crowded close to the road, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the stars. The GPS indicated he would stay on Highway 17 for approximately 30 miles before turning west again on a county road that would eventually reconnect with his route to Little Rock. Bram checked the estimated arrival time. It still showed 11:45 p.m., the same time the GPS had displayed before the detour. That was impossible. The detour added distance and reduced his average speed, which should have pushed the arrival time later. Unless the GPS was calculating based on speeds he could not safely maintain on these roads, the math did not work. Bram drove through the darkness with both hands on the wheel, his attention focused on the road ahead. The highway curved gently through the forest, rising and falling over low hills. He passed no other vehicles, no driveways, no signs of human habitation. The only structures he saw were occasional hunting stands mounted in trees near the roadside, their platforms dark and empty. After 20 minutes, he reached a small intersection where Highway 17 crossed a county road marked only by a number, Road 412. The GPS instructed him to turn left. Bram slowed and peered down the county road. It was even narrower than Highway 17, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass, and the pavement was cracked and overgrown with weeds. A green highway sign at the intersection indicated that the road led to a town called Barton, population unlisted. Bram had never heard of Barton, and it did not appear on his printed atlas. But the GPS was insistent, the route marked in bright blue with an arrow pointing left. Bram made the turn and followed Road 412 into deeper darkness. The forest changed character as he drove, the trees becoming older and more gnarled, their trunks thick and their branches twisted into strange shapes. Fog began to form in the low areas, wisps of white that drifted across the road and caught in the headlights like smoke. Bram reduced his speed further, navigating carefully around potholes and fallen branches. The GPS showed he had 12 miles to go on this road before reaching the next turn. Bram checked the time. 9:47 p.m. At his current pace, he would not reach Little Rock until well past midnight, regardless of what the GPS claimed. After 8 miles, the road descended into a valley and the fog thickened, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. Bram turned on his fog lights and slowed to a crawl, the trailer swaying slightly behind him as he navigated the uneven pavement. The trees disappeared into the mist on either side, and the road felt narrower, as if the fog itself were pressing in. Bram had driven through fog before, in California and Oregon and the Midwest, but this felt different, heavier somehow, and colder. The temperature gauge on his dashboard showed 52 degrees outside, but the air felt clamber and damp, the kind of cold that seeped through metal and glass. The GPS chimed, indicating an upcoming turn. Bram looked at the screen. The instruction read, "In 0.5 miles, arrive at ferry terminal. Proceed to loading." Bram stared at the words, his mind struggling to process them. Ferry terminal. He was in the middle of Arkansas, nowhere near a major river that would require a ferry. The Arkansas River was 40 miles north, and the Mississippi was far to the east. There should not be a ferry terminal on this route. Bram tapped the screen, trying to pull up more information, but the GPS only repeated the instruction. He continued driving, and after half a mile, the fog parted enough to reveal a structure ahead. It was a small building made of wood and corrugated metal, sitting at the edge of what appeared to be a body of water. Bram slowed to a stop and peered through the windshield. The building looked like a ferry terminal with a covered waiting area and a ticket window, but it was dark and appeared abandoned. The water beyond was obscured by fog, but Bram could hear the faint sound of waves lapping against a shore or dock. He checked his GPS again. The route showed him directly at the ferry terminal, with the next instruction reading, "Board ferry to continue route." Bram pulled up his atlas and compared it to the GPS display. According to the atlas, there was no water feature at this location, just forest and farmland. But his eyes told him otherwise. There was definitely water here, and a terminal, and the GPS was treating it as a necessary part of his route. Bram put the truck in park and climbed out, leaving the engine running. The air was thick with moisture, and the fog swirled around him as he walked towards the terminal building. The structure was old, with peeling paint and windows covered in grime. A wooden sign above the entrance read, "Barton Ferry, Este 1947, service hours vary." Bram tried the door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside, pulling a small flashlight from his pocket. The interior was a single large room with wooden benches along the walls and a ticket counter at the far end. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. It looked like the place had been closed for years, maybe decades. But on the counter, Bram saw something that made him stop. It was a schedule board, the kind with movable letters and numbers that could be rearranged to show ferry departure times. The board was old and faded, but someone had recently updated it. The dates were current, showing times for today's crossings. The hours listed were sparse: 8 o'clock a.m., 2 p.m., and 11 p.m. Bram checked his watch. It was 10:23 p.m. According to the schedule, the next ferry would depart in 37 minutes. He walked to the ticket counter and found a clipboard with a sign-in sheet. The page was yellowed with age, but there were entries on it, handwritten notes from drivers who had used the ferry. Bram scanned the entries looking for recent dates. Most were from decades ago, 1978, 1983, 91. But near the bottom of the page, there was an entry from last week. The handwriting was neat and precise. E. Vale, 10:19, 11 o'clock p.m. Crossing, paid in full. Bram did not recognize the name, but the date was recent enough to suggest the ferry was still operational, at least occasionally. He stepped back outside and walked toward the water, trying to get a better sense of the crossing. The fog was so thick he could not see more than 20 feet, but he could make out the shape of a dock extending into the water. The dock looked old but structurally sound, with metal railings and wooden planks that appeared recently replaced. He returned to the truck and sat in the cab, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told him to turn around and find another route, but the GPS offered no alternatives. When he tried to recalculate, the device simply displayed the same instruction. board the ferry. The road behind him was marked as closed on the GPS map, rendered in gray as if it no longer existed. Bram pulled out his phone to call the dispatcher, but there was no signal. He tried several times, moving the phone around the cab, but the screen showed 0 bars and no data connection. Bram sat in the silence, listening to the engine idle and the distant sound of water moving beyond the fog. He had hauled freight through every kind of weather and road condition imaginable, but he had never encountered a situation quite like this. A ferry that appeared on his GPS, but not on any map, operating on a schedule that suggested it ran only 3 times a day, in a location where no ferry should exist. The rational part of his mind said to turn around, find a different route, and report the GPS malfunction to his company. But the road behind him was supposedly closed, and he had a delivery deadline that was already in jeopardy. He checked the time again. 10:41 p.m., 19 minutes until the scheduled departure. Bram made a decision. He would wait for the ferry, see if it actually arrived, and cross if it seemed safe. If nothing happened by 11 p.m., he would turn around and navigate back to Highway 17, regardless of what the GPS said. It was a compromise between following the route and maintaining some control over the situation. Bram turned off the engine to conserve fuel and settled back in the seat, watching the fog drift across the windshield. The terminal building sat dark and silent to his left, and the dock extended into the murky water ahead. Somewhere on the other side of that water, if the GPS was accurate, was the continuation of his route. But what lay between here and there, and whether a ferry would actually materialize to carry him across, remained to be seen. The minutes ticked by slowly, and Bram waited, alone in the fog with a load of plumbing supplies and a growing sense that he had driven off the edge of the known world into something that operated by different rules entirely. Bram sat in the darkened cab and watched the minutes count down on his phone. 10:52 p.m., 8 minutes until the scheduled departure time. The fog had thickened even further, pressing against the windows like something with weight and substance. Through the windshield, Bram could barely make out the outline of the dock, and the water beyond was completely invisible. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the truck settling and the distant sound of water moving against pilings. At 10:58 p.m., Bram heard something new. A low rumble, faint at first but growing steadily louder. It sounded like an engine, but deeper and more labored than any truck or car. The sound came from across the water, from somewhere in the fog where the far shore should have been. Bram leaned forward, straining to see through the mist. The rumble grew closer, and with it came a new sound, the rhythmic churn of a propeller or paddle wheel pushing through water. The ferry emerged from the fog like a ghost materializing from smoke. It was smaller than Bram had expected, a flat-decked barge with metal railings and a small pilot house at one end. The vessel looked old, its hull streaked with rust and its deck boards weathered gray. But it was moving under its own power, cutting through the water with steady purpose. A single light burned above the pilot house, casting a weak yellow glow that barely penetrated the fog. Bram could see a figure in the pilot house, a silhouette behind the glass, but no details were visible. The ferry approached the dock and slowed, the engine throttling down as the vessel eased into position. There was a grinding sound as metal met wood, and then the ferry was secured, tied to the dock with thick ropes that someone on board had thrown over the pilings. A ramp lowered from the front of the ferry, its hinges squealing in protest. The ramp settled onto the dock with a heavy thud, creating a bridge between the shore and the vessel. The figure in the pilot house did not emerge, and no one called out or signaled for Bram to board. Bram started the truck engine and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, trying to decide if this was real or if he was experiencing some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fog. The ferry looked solid enough, and the sound of the engine was unmistakable. But everything about the situation felt wrong, from the location of the terminal to the timing of the ferry's arrival exactly at the scheduled hour. Bram thought about the sign-in sheet inside the terminal, the entry from E. Vale dated just last week. Someone had used this ferry recently. Someone had crossed this water and continued their journey. Bram put the truck in gear and eased forward, the headlights cutting through the fog as he approached the dock. The wooden planks creaked under the weight of the truck, but they held. He guided the rig onto the ramp, feeling it flex and settle as the front wheels rolled onto the ferry deck. The metal surface was slick with moisture, and Bram could feel the truck's tires searching for traction. He drove slowly, carefully, until the entire rig was aboard and centered on the deck. There was barely 3 feet of clearance on either side, and the trailer extended almost to the back edge of the ferry. Bram put the truck in park and engaged the parking brake, then sat waiting for some signal or instruction. The figure in the pilot house remained motionless, and no one appeared to secure the truck or collect payment. After a full minute of silence, the engine rumbled louder and the ferry began to move. The ramp lifted behind him with the same squealing protest, sealing him onto the vessel. Bram felt his stomach tighten. He was committed now, crossing water he could not see to reach a shore that might not exist. The ferry moved slowly, the pilot navigating blind through the fog. Bram could see nothing beyond the railings, just gray mist in every direction. The sound of the water changed as they moved from the dock area into deeper current, becoming a steady rushing that suggested the river or lake was wider than he had thought. Bram checked his GPS, hoping it would show his progress across the water, but the screen displayed only his starting location at the ferry terminal. The route ahead was blank, as if the software could not conceptualize what came next. Bram climbed out of the cab, deciding he needed to speak with whoever was piloting this vessel. The air outside was colder than it had been on shore, and the fog clung to his jacket like wet fabric. He walked carefully across the slick deck to the pilot house, his boots finding purchase on the textured metal. The pilot house door was closed, and through the window, Bram could see the silhouette still standing at the wheel. He knocked on the door, the sound flat and absorbed by the fog. No response. Bram knocked again, harder this time. The silhouette did not move or turn. Bram tried the door handle and found it locked. He peered through the window trying to make out details, but the glass was fogged from the inside and he could see nothing clearly. "Hey!" Bram called out, his voice sounding small and muffled. "I need to know where we are going. How long is the crossing?" Still no response. The figure at the wheel remained perfectly still, hands on the controls, facing forward into the fog. Bram stepped back and looked around the ferry deck. There were no other passengers, no other vehicles, just his truck sitting alone on the metal platform. He walked to the railing and looked over the side, trying to gauge the depth and speed of the water. The surface was dark and smooth, moving past at a steady pace. Bram could not tell if they were crossing a river or a lake, and the fog made it impossible to see either shore. He checked his watch. 11:09 p.m. They had been on the water for 6 minutes. He returned to the truck and climbed back into the cab, locking the doors behind him. The sense of wrongness that had been building all evening was now a constant pressure in his chest, making it difficult to breathe normally. Bram pulled out his phone and tried again to get a signal. 0 bars. He tried the CB radio, cycling through the channels and calling out for anyone monitoring. Static answered him on every frequency, thick and unchanging. He was completely cut off, isolated on a ferry that should not exist, crossing water that was not on any map. The ferry continued its steady progress through the fog. Bram watched the clock on his phone. counting the minutes. 10 minutes, 15, 20. The crossing was taking far longer than seemed reasonable for a river or small lake. After 25 minutes, Bram began to seriously consider that they were lost, that the pilot had become disoriented in the fog and was navigating in circles. But the engine maintained its steady rhythm, and the water continued to flow past in the same direction, suggesting they were still making forward progress. At 32 minutes, the fog ahead began to thin. Bram sat up straighter, watching as shapes started to emerge from the mist. Trees appeared first, dark silhouettes against the gray, and then the outline of a shore. The ferry was approaching land. Bram felt a rush of relief mixed with lingering unease. They had made it across, wherever across was. The ferry slowed as it approached the dock, and Bram could see that this terminal was nearly identical to the one they had departed from. A small building, a covered waiting area, and a wooden dock extending into the water. The ferry bumped against the dock with a gentle impact, and the ramp lowered with the same squealing hinges. Bram started the engine and waited for some signal to proceed. When none came, he eased the truck forward, rolling off the ferry and onto the dock. The wooden planks groaned under the weight but held firm. Bram drove slowly up the dock and onto solid ground, following a gravel road that led away from the water. He checked his mirrors and saw the ferry already pushing away from the dock, heading back into the fog without waiting for additional passengers. Bram drove about 100 yards from the terminal and pulled over, putting the truck in park. He needed to get his bearings, to figure out where he was and how to proceed. The GPS was still not displaying the surrounding area, just showing his location as a blue dot on a blank screen. Bram pulled out his atlas and tried to estimate based on the time and direction of travel, but without knowing what body of water he had crossed, he could not pinpoint his location. He climbed out of the truck and looked around. The gravel road continued ahead, disappearing into forest similar to what he had driven through to reach the ferry. There were no signs, no markers, nothing to indicate where this road led. Bram walked back toward the terminal, hoping to find a map or information board. The building here was identical to the one on the other side, same weathered wood and corrugated metal. The door was unlocked, and Bram stepped inside. The interior was a mirror image of the first terminal, same layout, same wooden benches and ticket counter. But this room showed more signs of use. The dust was thinner, and there were fresh footprints on the floor, boot prints that led from the door to the counter and back. Bram followed the prints to the counter and found another clipboard, another sign-in sheet. This one had more recent entries, several from the past month. Bram scanned the names and dates, looking for E. Vale. He found it 3 entries from the bottom. E. Vale, 10:19, 11:42 p.m. Arrival, proceeding west. Bram checked his watch. It was 11:44 p.m. now, just 2 minutes later than when E. Vale had signed in last week. The coincidence was unsettling, but Bram tried to focus on the practical information. E. Vale had proceeded west, which suggested the road ahead led in that direction. Bram pulled out a pen from his pocket and added his own entry to the sheet. B. Hollis, 10:26, 11:44 p.m. arrival. He hesitated, then added, cargo delivery to Little Rock. He wanted there to be a record, something to prove he had been here if things went wrong. As he set the pen down, Bram noticed something else on the counter. It was a business card, slightly water-damaged but still legible. The card read, Calder Mott, County Deputy, Emergency Contact. Below the name was a phone number. Bram pulled out his phone and checked for a signal. Still nothing. But the presence of the card suggested that there was some official awareness of this ferry crossing, that it was not entirely off the grid. Bram pocketed the card and left the terminal. He returned to the truck and continued along the gravel road, following it as it wound through the forest. The GPS finally updated, showing the road ahead and a route that would take him west to reconnect with his original path to Little Rock. The estimated arrival time displayed as 12:47 a.m., just over an hour from now. That seemed reasonable if the road ahead was passable. Bram accelerated to 40 miles per hour, eager to put distance between himself and the ferry terminal. After about 10 minutes, the gravel road intersected with a paved county highway. A green sign indicated that the highway led west to a town called Carlisle, 30 miles ahead. Bram recognized the name from his atlas. Carlisle was on his route, a small town between here and Little Rock. If he could reach Carlisle, he could get back on familiar roads and salvage the delivery. He turned onto the highway and increased his speed to 55, the truck handling smoothly on the paved surface. The fog had thinned considerably on this side of the water, and Bram could see the road clearly for several hundred yards ahead. The forest continued on both sides, but the trees were more spread out here, with occasional clearings and farmland visible in the distance. Bram began to relax slightly, his grip on the wheel loosening. Maybe the worst was over. Maybe the ferry crossing had been real, just an obscure route that GPS software occasionally suggested for reasons he did not understand. But then his phone rang. The sound was so unexpected in the silence that Bram flinched, nearly swerving into the opposite lane. He grabbed the phone from the cup holder and looked at the screen. The caller ID showed Calder Mott, County Deputy. Bram stared at the name, his mind racing. He had just picked up that business card 15 minutes ago. There was no way anyone could know he had it, and even less reason for a county deputy to be calling him at midnight. Bram hesitated, then answered the call. "Hello?" His voice sounded uncertain even to himself. A man's voice came through the speaker, calm and measured. "This is Deputy Mott. Am I speaking with Bram Hollis?" Bram's throat tightened. "Yes. How did you get this number?" There was a pause, then the deputy continued as if he had not heard the question. "Mr. Hollis, I am calling to provide directions for the remainder of your route. You are currently on County Highway 163, heading west. In approximately 8 miles, you will reach an intersection with State Highway 13. Do not take that highway." Bram felt a chill run through him. "Why not? Highway 13 is my fastest route to Carlisle." The deputy's voice remained calm, almost soothing. "Highway 13 is under construction. The bridge at mile marker 7 is out. If you take that route, you will be forced to turn around, and you will lose significant time. Instead, continue on County Highway 163 for another 12 miles until you reach the town of Des Arcs. From there, take Highway 33 west. It will add 10 minutes to your trip, but you will avoid the detour." Bram pulled over to the side of the road, his heart pounding. "How do you know where I am right now?" Another pause, longer this time. "The ferry terminal has a tracking system for commercial vehicles. We monitor crossings to ensure driver safety. Your truck was logged when you departed the terminal." The explanation sounded plausible, but something in the deputy's tone made Bram suspicious. "I need to verify this with my dispatcher. Can I call you back?" "Of course," the deputy said smoothly. "But Mr. Hollis, I would encourage you to follow the alternate route I have provided. The construction on Highway 13 is recent, and your GPS may not reflect the closure. Proceeding in that direction will only cause delays." The line went dead before Bram could respond. He looked at the phone screen. The call had lasted 1 minute and 47 seconds, and the number displayed matched the one on the business card. Bram tried to call back, but the number went straight to a recording. "The number you have dialed is not in service." Bram set the phone down and gripped the wheel with both hands, trying to steady his breathing. The deputy's call had provided useful information, but the timing and the knowledge of his location felt invasive and impossible. No one should have known he was on this road, especially not within minutes of his departure from the ferry. And the explanation about a tracking system did not ring true. Ferry terminals, especially old ones in the middle of nowhere, did not have sophisticated vehicle tracking. Bram checked the GPS. The device showed Highway 13 ahead, marked as the fastest route to Carlisle. There was no indication of construction or a bridge closure. But GPS systems did not always update in real time, and if the closure was recent, it might not be reflected in the software. Bram faced another choice: trust the deputy's directions and take the alternate route, or follow the GPS and risk running into a closed bridge that would cost him hours of backtracking. He thought about the ferry, about the schedule that had been updated recently, about the sign-in sheet with E. Vale's entry. There was a pattern here, a system that seemed to be guiding him along a specific path. Whether that system was benign or malicious, he could not tell. But every step of this journey had led him further from familiar territory and deeper into a landscape that operated by rules he did not understand. Bram made his decision. He would follow the deputy's directions, take County Highway 163 to Des Arcs, and then head west on Highway 33. It would add time, but it felt safer than charging ahead into potentially blocked roads. He pulled back onto the highway and continued driving, watching for the intersection with Highway 13 that he would now avoid. Bram drove through the night with Deputy Mott's directions playing on a loop in his mind. The intersection with Highway 13 appeared exactly where the GPS indicated it would, marked by a green sign that showed distances to various towns. Bram slowed as he approached, looking for any indication of construction or road closure warnings. There were none. The highway looked clear and well-maintained, stretching north into the darkness with fresh lane markings visible in his headlights. For a moment, Bram considered ignoring the deputy's advice and taking the faster route. But something made him continue straight on County Highway 163. Maybe it was the memory of the deputy's calm, certain voice, or the way every other instruction tonight had proven accurate despite seeming impossible. Or maybe it was just exhaustion wearing down his ability to trust his own judgment. Whatever the reason, Bram stayed on 163 and watched Highway 13 disappear in his mirrors. The road ahead narrowed slightly, running through farmland that lay dark and fallow under the night sky. Scattered houses appeared occasionally, their windows unlit, their driveways empty. After 6 miles, Bram saw something that made his foot ease off the accelerator. On the shoulder ahead, illuminated by his headlights, was a highway patrol vehicle parked at an angle with its emergency lights off. As Bram drew closer, he could see an officer standing beside the vehicle, arms crossed, watching the road. The officer made no move to flag him down or signal, just stood there in the darkness observing. Bram checked his speed, confirmed he was well within the limit, and continued past. In his side mirror, he watched the officer remain motionless, not even turning to watch the truck pass. Bram's hands tightened on the wheel. The encounter felt staged, like the officer had been placed there specifically for him to see. A reminder that he was being watched, that his route was being monitored. But by whom and for what purpose remained unclear. The deputy's phone call, the officer on the roadside, the ferry that had arrived exactly on schedule. They all suggested a level of coordination that went beyond normal traffic management. Someone or something was shepherding him along a predetermined path, making sure he stayed on course. The town of Des Arcs appeared after another 8 miles, a small cluster of buildings gathered around a main street intersection. Most of the businesses were closed at this hour, their signs dark and their parking lots empty. Bram followed the signs for Highway 33 west, finding the turn without difficulty. The highway was wider than the county road, a proper 2-lane state route with clear markings and regular mile markers. Bram's GPS updated to show this new route, and for the first time in hours, the estimated arrival time at Little Rock seemed realistic. 1:15 a.m., just over an hour away. Bram allowed himself to hope that the worst was behind him. He had made it across the ferry, navigated the detour, and was now on a recognized highway heading in the right direction. The delivery might be late, but he could still complete it tonight and file a report about the GPS malfunction and the unexpected ferry crossing. His company would want documentation, and Bram had plenty to provide: the terminal locations, the sign-in sheets, the business card from Deputy Mott. It would be enough to justify the delays and explain the unusual route. But 20 minutes into the drive on Highway 33, Bram's phone chimed with an alert. He glanced at the screen and saw a notification from the delivery app his company used to manage shipments. The notification read, "Delivery address updated. New location confirmed." Bram's stomach dropped. He pulled over onto the shoulder and opened the app, navigating to his current shipment details. The delivery address had changed. Instead of the construction site in Little Rock that he had been heading toward all night, the address now showed a warehouse facility in a town called Pine Bluff, 40 miles southeast of Little Rock. Bram stared at the screen, reading the address 3 times to make sure he was seeing it correctly. Pine Bluff was in the opposite direction from where he was heading. The new route would add another 90 minutes to his trip and take him even further from the interstate. Bram checked the timestamp on the update. It had been entered at 11:52 p.m. while he was crossing on the ferry with no cell signal. Someone had changed the delivery location during the exact window when he could not receive the notification or respond to it. He tried calling the dispatcher, but the call would not connect. The phone showed a signal now, 2 bars, but every attempt to dial out resulted in the same error message. Call cannot be completed as dialed. Bram tried the main office number, the after-hours emergency line, even his supervisor's personal cell. None of them would connect. It was as if his phone had been selectively blocked from making outgoing calls while still allowing him to receive notifications and texts. Bram sat on the shoulder with the engine idling, trying to decide what to do. He could ignore the address change and proceed to the original destination in Little Rock. But if the delivery location had legitimately been updated, showing up at the wrong warehouse would cause significant problems. The cargo would be refused, the delivery would be marked as failed, and Bram would face potential penalties and lost income. On the other hand, if the address change was fraudulent, or part of whatever manipulation had been guiding him all night, driving to Pine Bluff could lead him even deeper into danger. Bram pulled out the paperwork from the original pickup in Memphis, looking for a customer contact number. He found one and tried dialing it on his phone. This call connected, ringing twice before going to an automated voicemail system. Bram left a message explaining the situation and requesting confirmation of the delivery address, then ended the call. He knew it was unlikely anyone would check voicemail at 1 in the morning, but at least he had tried to verify the information through proper channels. With no other options available, Bram made the decision to follow the updated address. If it was wrong, he would have documentation showing he had followed the instructions provided by the company system. He entered Pine Bluff into his GPS and started the new route. The device calculated the path and displayed an estimated arrival time of 2:47 a.m. Bram pulled back onto the highway and headed southeast, watching the mile markers count upward as he drove deeper into Arkansas. The highway was almost empty at this hour, with only occasional vehicles passing in the opposite direction. Bram kept his speed steady at 60 miles per hour, fighting the fatigue that was beginning to drag at his consciousness. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours, and the stress of the evening had drained him more than any normal drive. His eyes felt gritty, and his thoughts were starting to blur at the edges, random associations and half-formed ideas intruding on his concentration. After 30 minutes, Bram saw another highway patrol vehicle, this one parked on an overpass above the highway. The vehicle's lights were off, but someone was standing on the overpass railing, looking down at the traffic. Bram could not make out details in the darkness, just a silhouette backlit by distant streetlights. As Bram passed underneath, he glanced up through the windshield. The figure remained motionless, watching. Bram accelerated slightly, an irrational urge to put distance between himself and the overpass. His phone chimed again. Another notification, this time a text message from an unknown number. Bram picked up the phone and read the message. Maintain current route. Do not deviate. Arrival window, 2:45-2:50 a.m. The message had no signature, no identifying information. Bram stared at it, his pulse quickening. The arrival window was exactly what his GPS was showing, accurate to within minutes. Whoever sent the message had access to his location, his route, and his estimated arrival time in real time. Bram typed a reply. "Who is this?" He sent the message and waited. 3 dots appeared, indicating someone was typing a response. The dots pulsed for several seconds, then disappeared. No message came through. Bram tried again. "I need to verify the delivery address. Please confirm." The same pattern, 3 dots, then nothing. Whoever was on the other end was monitoring his messages but choosing not to respond. Bram tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and gripped the wheel with both hands. He was being herded, guided along a specific path with just enough information to keep him moving but not enough to understand the full picture. Every attempt to communicate with the outside world was blocked or redirected. He was isolated, alone in his truck on a dark highway, following instructions from sources he could not verify or trust. The town of Pine Bluff appeared on the horizon around 2:35 a.m., its lights reflecting off low clouds that had moved in during the past hour. Bram followed the GPS directions through the quiet streets, passing closed businesses and residential neighborhoods. The warehouse address was on the industrial edge of town, in a district of large metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing. Bram found the correct street and drove slowly, looking for building numbers. The warehouse was at the end of a dead-end road, set back from the street behind a wide gravel lot. The building was dark, with no lights visible in the windows or above the loading docks. A sign near the entrance read, "Riverside Distribution, Receiving Hours, MF 6 a.m. 4 p.m. Bram checked his watch. It was 2:43 a.m., well outside receiving hours. The facility was clearly closed, and there was no one here to accept the delivery. Bram pulled into the lot and parked near the loading docks, leaving the engine running. He climbed out and walked to the nearest dock, looking for any signs of activity. The dock doors were all closed and locked, and there were no lights inside the building. Bram walked around to the front entrance and found it similarly secured, with a keypad lock and a sign directing after-hours deliveries to call a phone number. Bram pulled out his phone and tried the number. It rang once, then disconnected. He returned to the truck and sat in the cab, staring at the dark warehouse. This could not be the correct delivery location. No legitimate operation would schedule a delivery for the middle of the night at a facility that was clearly closed. But the address in the system had been updated, and Bram had followed the instructions he was given. He pulled out his camera and took several photos of the warehouse, the address sign, and the closed loading docks. If this turned into a dispute, he wanted documentation. As Bram was reviewing the photos, he noticed something in one of the images that he had not seen with his eyes. In the background, barely visible in the darkness beyond the warehouse, there was a structure on the far side of the property. It looked like another building, smaller than the main warehouse, with a single light burning above what appeared to be a door. Bram zoomed in on the image, trying to make out details. The structure was set back in the trees, connected to the main lot by a narrow gravel path. Bram looked up from the phone and peered into the darkness where the photo indicated the structure should be. He could just barely make out the glow of the light, a faint yellow point in the distance. He sat for a moment, debating whether to investigate. Every instinct told him to stay in the truck, to wait until morning, or until he could reach someone at his company who could clarify the situation. But the light suggested someone was there, and if this was where he was supposed to deliver the cargo, he needed to confirm it. Bram grabbed his flashlight and climbed out of the truck, walking toward the gravel path. The path was overgrown with weeds, suggesting it was not regularly used. Bram followed it into the trees, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead. After about 100 yards, the path opened into a small clearing where the structure stood. It was a cinder block building, single-story, with no windows and a single metal door. The light above the door was on, and there was a sign mounted beside it. Receiving, night deliveries only. Bram approached the door and knocked. The sound echoed flatly, absorbed by the surrounding trees. No response. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked. The door swung open, revealing a small office space lit by a single overhead bulb. The room was sparse, containing only a desk, a filing cabinet, and a chair. On the desk was a clipboard with a delivery log, similar to the sign-in sheets he had seen at the ferry terminals. Bram stepped inside and examined the log. There were 3 entries on the current page, all from the past week. The first entry read, E. Vale, 10/19, 2:48 a.m., Pine Bluff, 26 pallets industrial. The second entry was from 10/22, a different name Bram did not recognize. The third entry was blank except for a time, 2:45, 2:50 a.m., 10:26, today's date, the arrival window from the text message. Bram felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. This entry had been prepared for him, left blank for him to fill in. The time window matched his arrival exactly. He looked around the small office, searching for cameras or any indication of who had prepared this log. There was nothing, just the desk and the filing cabinet and the oppressive silence of the surrounding forest. On the wall behind the desk was a map, yellowed with age, showing the region around Pine Bluff. Several locations were marked with red circles, and thin red lines connected them in a web-like pattern. Bram recognized one of the locations as the ferry terminal where he had crossed. Another was marked at the intersection where he had decided not to take Highway 13. A third was here, at this warehouse. The lines connecting them formed a route, the exact route he had driven tonight. Bram's hands began to shake. This was not random. This was not a series of coincidences or GPS malfunctions. Someone had planned this route, had marked these locations, and had guided him from point to point with phone calls and text messages and address changes. But why? What was the purpose of roading him through an obscure ferry crossing and along back roads to reach a warehouse that could have been accessed directly from the interstate in half the time? He looked back at the delivery log and noticed something else. Next to each entry was a notation: transfer complete, proceed to secondary. The entries were not recording deliveries to this location. They were recording transfers, shipments being moved from one truck to another or one location to another. Bram thought about the pallets in his trailer, the industrial plumbing supplies he had loaded in Memphis. He had not inspected them since the pickup, had not verified their contents or checked them against the manifest. Bram left the office and walked quickly back to his truck. He grabbed the paperwork from the cab and reviewed it under the dome light. The manifest listed 22 pallets of plumbing supplies, each one itemized by type and weight. But Bram remembered loading 23 pallets in Memphis. He had counted them himself as the warehouse crew secured them in the trailer. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos, finding the images he had taken of the loaded trailer. He counted the pallets in the photo. 23. The manifest had changed, just like the temperature logs in the reefer trailer on US 83. just like the photos of the frost patterns. Or maybe the manifest had always shown 22, and Bram's memory was faulty. He could not tell anymore what was real and what was false, what had been altered and what he was imagining. The night had eroded his ability to trust his own perceptions. Bram walked to the rear of the trailer and unlocked the doors, swinging them open. The interior was dark, and he aimed his flashlight inside, counting the pallets. 22. One was missing, or one had never been there, or Bram had miscounted in Memphis. He climbed into the trailer and inspected the remaining pallets, looking for any signs of tampering. The shrink wrap was intact on all of them. The straps were secure and nothing appeared disturbed. But in the space where a 23rd pallet should have been, where Bram's memory insisted one had been loaded, there was a small patch of discoloration on the trailer floor. The metal was darker there, as if something had been sitting in that spot for a long time and had left a stain. Bram crouched down and touched the discoloration. The metal was slightly warmer than the surrounding floor, still holding residual heat from whatever had rested there. Bram backed out of the trailer and closed the doors, his mind racing. One pallet had been removed during the journey, taken from the trailer during one of his stops, or while he was crossing on the ferry. Or it had never been loaded, and the whole memory was a fabrication, a trick of his exhausted mind. He returned to the small office in the trees and picked up the pen attached to the clipboard. In the blank entry he wrote, B. Hollis, 10:26, 2:47 a.m., Pine Bluff, 22 pallets, industrial. As soon as he finished writing, he heard an engine start in the distance. Bram stepped outside and looked toward the main warehouse. A truck was pulling out of the lot, a semi similar to his own, but with no company markings. The truck turned onto the road and headed back toward town, its taillights disappearing quickly into the darkness. Bram ran back to his rig, but by the time he reached the main lot, the other truck was gone. Bram climbed into his cab and sat breathing hard, trying to process what he had just seen. Another truck had been here, hidden somewhere on the property, waiting. Waiting for what? For Bram to arrive? For him to log his delivery and confirm the transfer? He did not know, and he was not sure he wanted to know. His phone chimed one final time. A text message from the same unknown number. Delivery confirmed. Proceed to original destination, Little Rock. New ETA, 4:15 a.m. Bram stared at the message. The original destination, the construction site in Little Rock, was back on. The detour to Pine Bluff had apparently served its purpose, and now he was being redirected to complete the job he had started in Memphis. Bram started the engine and pulled out of the lot, following the GPS as it recalculated the route to Little Rock. He drove through the sleeping town of Pine Bluff and back onto the highway, heading northwest now. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the first hint of dawn touching the horizon. Bram had been on the road for nearly 10 hours, and he still had another 90 minutes to go. He reached Little Rock just after 4 a.m. and found the construction site without difficulty. The site was active even at this hour, with work lights illuminating the area and crew members moving equipment. Bram backed up to the designated unloading zone and waited while a foreman reviewed his paperwork. The foreman checked the manifest, verified the pallet count, and signed the delivery receipt without comment. The cargo was offloaded efficiently, and within 30 minutes Bram was cleared to leave. As he drove away from the construction site, Bram felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. The delivery was complete, the job was done, and he had documentation showing he had followed all instructions and arrived on time, despite the unexpected route changes. But the night had left him with questions that had no answers, and memories that might or might not be real. He found a truck stop on the outskirts of Little Rock and pulled in, parking in a far corner away from other vehicles. He was exhausted, but he knew he would not be able to sleep. Instead, he pulled out the business card for Deputy Calder Mott and tried calling the number one more time. The call went through, ringing normally, and this time someone answered. Mott. The voice was the same calm, measured tone from the earlier call. Bram's mouth went dry. This is Bram Hollis. You called me last night with directions. There was a pause. I am sorry, Mr. Hollis, but I think you have the wrong number. I did not call anyone last night. I was off duty. Bram felt his chest tighten. You are Deputy Calder Mott, County Sheriff's Department. Another pause, longer this time. Yes, that is correct. But I do not know who you are, and I did not call you. Perhaps you should check your phone log. The call ended. Bram pulled up his call history and scrolled to the previous night. The entry for Calder Mott's call was gone. The entire conversation, 1 minute and 47 seconds, had been erased from the log. Bram checked his text messages. The messages from the unknown number were also gone, deleted as if they had never existed. Bram sat in the darkened cab and stared at his phone. Everything that could have proven what happened last night had been systematically removed or altered. The photos, the call logs, the text messages, even the manifest showing 23 pallets had reverted to 22. He was left with only his memory, and he was no longer certain he could trust even that. He thought about E. Vale, whose name had appeared in multiple sign-in sheets along the route. Had Vale experienced the same night, driven the same roads, crossed the same ferry? Was Vale even real, or just another name planted in the logs to make Bram feel less alone? There was no way to know, and no one Bram could ask who would not think he was suffering from exhaustion or hallucinations. Bram decided he would not report the ferry crossing or the detour to Pine Bluff. He would submit his delivery confirmation showing he had completed the job on time, and he would accept the next assignment without question. Speaking about what happened would only raise concerns about his fitness to drive, and Bram could not afford to lose his CDL over something he could not prove. But 3 days later, when dispatch offered him a run that would take him through Arkansas, Bram declined. He cited personal reasons and requested routes that kept him in other states. The dispatcher did not press for details, just assigned him to a northbound run through Missouri instead. Bram was grateful for the flexibility and tried not to think about the ferry terminal sitting dark and waiting on some unnamed river, or the small office in the woods behind a warehouse in Pine Bluff, or the truck with no markings that had driven away in the night. A week after the delivery, Bram received his payment confirmation and noticed something odd. The invoice included a line item he did not recognize. Special routing fee, night transfer, $8,470. The fee had been added to his compensation, paid directly into his account along with the standard delivery payment. Bram had not requested any special routing, and he had never seen such a fee on any previous invoice. He called the accounting department to inquire about the charge, and was told it was a standard fee for deliveries that required ferry crossings or alternate routing due to road conditions. When Bram asked for more details, the clerk could not provide any, saying the fee had been automatically calculated by the system based on his GPS data. Bram ended the call without pressing further. Someone had paid him for using the ferry, had compensated him for the extra time and the unusual route, which meant the whole thing had been planned, budgeted, and approved at a level above his dispatcher. Bram kept the invoice and filed it with his other paperwork. It was not proof of anything specific, but it was evidence that the night had happened, that the ferry crossing and the detour were real in some official capacity. He thought about framing it, keeping it as a reminder, but in the end he just left it in the filing cabinet with hundreds of other invoices from hundreds of other deliveries. Sometimes, late at night when he was parked at a truck stop between runs, Bram would pull up a map on his phone and search for the ferry terminal. But no matter how carefully he traced County Road 412, or how far he zoomed in on the river crossings in eastern Arkansas, he could never find it. The terminal did not exist on any digital map, and the road that had led him there was not marked on any GPS system he could access. But Bram knew it was there, somewhere in the fog and the forest, waiting for the next driver whose route would be mysteriously recalculated, whose GPS would insist on a detour, whose phone would ring with calm instructions from a deputy who would later deny making the call. And when that driver arrived at the terminal, they would find the schedule board updated with current times, and a sign-in sheet with entries from people who had crossed before, and a ferry that would emerge from the fog exactly on time, piloted by a figure who never spoke and never turned around. The road remembered. The ferry still ran. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in a dispatch office, another route was being planned, another driver selected, another midnight crossing scheduled for a date that had not yet arrived, but had already been written in ink on a yellowed page that smelled of river water and old wood.